What if the greatest illusions we face aren't supernatural at all, but hidden inside our own minds? Imagine living in a world where every choice you make, every belief you hold, and every memory you cherish might not be entirely yours. Beneath the surface of rational thought lies a labyrinth of invisible forces, subtle manipulations that bend perception, warp judgment, and quietly steer behavior. These aren't tricks of magicians, but the mind games of psychology, deeply rooted in human nature and backed by decades of research. Think about it. How many times have you felt certain of a memory, only to discover it never happened? How often have you chosen something believing it was a free decision, when in reality, your choice was carefully engineered by context, suggestion, or social pressure? We like to think of ourselves as captains of our own ships, but psychology reveals we're often drifting on currents we cannot see. This isn't just about curiosities. It is a journey into the most unsettling corners of human cognition, from illusions that shape our memories to biases that hijack our decisions, from subtle manipulations in everyday life to paradoxes that challenge free will itself. These mind games expose the fragility of our reality. Once you see them, you can't unsee them, and the deeper you go, the more you'll realize the battlefield of truth and deception isn't out there. It's inside your own head. So sit back, let the rain fall, and prepare to explore the psychological forces you never knew were controlling you. 1. The illusory truth effect. Imagine a world where truth isn't determined by evidence, but by the number of times you've heard something. Welcome to one of the most unsettling paradoxes of human cognition, the illusory truth effect. Picture this scenario. You're scrolling through social media and you encounter a claim that we only use 10% of our brains. You've seen this fact countless times in movies, casual conversations, motivational posts. It feels familiar, comfortable, true. But here's the twist that would make any philosopher's head spin. This truth is completely false, yet your brain has been quietly filing it away as reality simply because of repetition. The illusory truth effect reveals a fundamental flaw in how we process information. Our brains, those magnificent pattern recognition machines, have developed a cognitive shortcut that equates familiarity with truth. When we encounter information repeatedly, our neural pathways process it more fluently, like a well-worn path through a forest. This ease of processing creates what psychologists call processing fluency, and our brains mistakenly interpret this smooth mental flow as a signal of truth. The paradox deepens when we consider that this effect persists even when people know the information is false. In the original 1977 study by Hasher, Goldstein, and Tapino, participants were explicitly told that certain statements were false. Yet, after repeated exposure, they still rated these false statements as more likely to be true than novel statements. It's as if our rational mind and our intuitive processing system are operating on completely different wavelengths. This psychological phenomenon doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's the invisible architect of our information age. Marketing executives have weaponized this effect, turning slogans into perceived truths through sheer repetition. "Just do it" isn't just a catchphrase, it becomes a life philosophy. Political propagandists understand that a lie repeated often enough begins to feel like truth, regardless of evidence to the contrary. The most chilling aspect of this mind game is its unconscious nature. We don't choose to believe repeated information. Our brains do it automatically, beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Recent longitudinal studies from 2021 have shown that this effect works across time intervals from minutes to months, suggesting that our susceptibility to false repeated information is both immediate and persistent. Consider the implications. In our hyper-connected world, where information spreads at the speed of light, and algorithms amplify popular content, the illusory truth effect has become a force that shapes collective reality. Echo chambers don't just reinforce our beliefs, they literally rewire our sense of what's true. The paradox forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If our brains are hardwired to mistake repetition for truth, how can we ever trust our own judgment about what's real? The answer lies in understanding that recognizing this bias is the first step toward transcending it. When we become aware of our brain's tendency to conflate familiarity with truth, we can begin to implement conscious strategies to verify information, seek diverse sources, and question our automatic responses. This mind game reveals that truth and perception are far more malleable than we'd like to believe. It suggests that reality, at least as we experience it, is partially constructed by the frequency of our encounters with information. In a world where fake news spreads faster than verified facts, understanding the illusory truth effect isn't just intellectually interesting, it's essential for navigating modern life with clarity and wisdom. 2. The decoy effect. Step into a movie theater and you're about to witness one of the most elegant psychological manipulations ever devised. You approach the concession stand and the prices seem straightforward. Small popcorn for $3, medium for $6.50, large for $7.50. Your brain quickly calculates that the large is obviously the better deal, only $1 more for significantly more popcorn. But here's the mind-bending reality. You've just fallen victim to the decoy effect, and your rational choice was carefully orchestrated. The decoy effect, also known as asymmetric dominance, reveals a profound paradox about human decision-making. Our preferences aren't fixed internal values, but malleable constructs that can be manipulated by the presence of irrelevant alternatives. The medium popcorn, the decoy, wasn't meant to be purchased. It was strategically priced to make the large popcorn appear irresistibly valuable. This psychological phenomenon strikes at the heart of economic theory, which assumes that adding irrelevant options shouldn't change preferences between existing choices. Yet human psychology operates by an entirely different logic. We don't evaluate options in isolation. We make comparisons, and those comparisons can be hijacked by clever third options. The mechanics of this mind game are beautifully simple, yet profoundly unsettling. The decoy is designed to be clearly inferior to one option, the target, while being only partially inferior to another. This creates what psychologists call dominance reasoning, a mental shortcut where we choose the option that obviously beats another option. The decoy doesn't need to be attractive. It just needs to make the target look attractive by comparison. Dan Ariely's groundbreaking MIT experiments revealed just how powerful this effect can be. In his famous magazine subscription study, students were offered 3 options: online-only subscription for $59, print only for $125, and print plus online for $125. When all 3 options were present, 84% chose the print plus online option. But when the seemingly useless print-only option was removed, only 32% chose the print plus online option. The presence of the decoy completely reversed people's preferences. The paradox becomes even more intriguing when we consider that the decoy effect works even when people are aware of it. Knowledge of the manipulation doesn't eliminate its influence, a phenomenon that challenges our assumptions about rational decision-making. It's as if our brains are running 2 separate systems, one that understands the manipulation intellectually, and another that responds to the comparative signals automatically. This mind game operates everywhere in our daily lives, often invisibly. Restaurants place expensive items on menus not to sell them, but to make moderately priced items seem reasonable. Real estate agents show overpriced houses first to make the actual target property appear like a bargain. Technology companies offer multiple service tiers specifically to guide customers toward their preferred option. The deeper philosophical implications are staggering. If our preferences can be systematically manipulated by irrelevant alternatives, what does this say about free will and autonomous choice? Are we truly making independent decisions, or are we simply responding to carefully crafted choice architectures? The decoy effect reveals that context isn't just important, it's everything. Our brains don't have access to absolute value scales. They work through relative comparisons. This makes us vulnerable to manipulation, but also provides insights into how we can make better decisions. By understanding that our preferences are contextual, we can become more aware of when our choices might be influenced by irrelevant factors. The paradox forces us to reconsider what we mean by rational decision-making. Perhaps true rationality isn't about making consistent choices in isolation, but about understanding the contextual influences that shape our decisions and compensating for them. In a world where choice architecture is increasingly sophisticated, recognizing the decoy effect becomes a crucial skill for maintaining autonomy in our decision-making. 3. The curse of knowledge. Picture a brilliant professor standing before a classroom of eager students, explaining a concept that seems crystal clear to her. She uses technical terminology, assumes background knowledge, and moves quickly through complex ideas. The students look confused, frustrated, even defeated. The professor, genuinely puzzled by their confusion, thinks, "This is so obvious. Why don't they understand?" She's trapped in one of psychology's most ironic paradoxes, the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge reveals a fundamental contradiction in human cognition. The very expertise that makes us knowledgeable becomes a barrier to communicating that knowledge to others. Once we acquire specialized understanding, we lose the ability to simulate the mental state of not knowing. Our brains, optimized for using knowledge efficiently, cannot easily unknow what we've learned. This psychological phenomenon was formally identified by Kammerer, Lowenstein, and Weber in 1989, building on earlier work about hindsight bias. The curse manifests as an inability to accurately assess what less informed people understand, leading to communication breakdowns across expertise gaps. But the deeper paradox lies in the fact that knowledge, traditionally viewed as purely beneficial, creates its own form of cognitive limitation. Consider the mechanics of this mind game. When experts process information in their domain, they use rich, interconnected mental models that allow them to see patterns, make connections, and understand implications that novices simply cannot perceive. This expertise creates what psychologists call chunking, the ability to group complex information into meaningful units. But this mental efficiency comes at a cost. Experts lose access to the step-by-step reasoning that novices need to follow. The curse operates across countless domains. Software developers create user interfaces that make perfect sense to them but baffle ordinary users. Doctors explain medical conditions using jargon that patients can't understand, then wonder why patients don't follow treatment plans. Financial advisors assume clients understand concepts like compound interest or risk tolerance that actually require significant background knowledge. The most insidious aspect of this curse is its invisibility to those who suffer from it. Experts don't realize they're cursed because their expertise makes everything seem obvious to them. They experience what psychologists call false consensus bias, the assumption that others share their knowledge and perspective. This creates a communication gap that widens with expertise, paradoxically making the most knowledgeable people less effective at sharing their knowledge. Stanford Business School studies have shown that the curse of knowledge significantly impacts strategic communication effectiveness. Leaders who have deep understanding of their company's strategy often fail to communicate it clearly to employees, assuming everyone shares their context and comprehension. The result is strategic confusion and poor execution, despite the leader's good intentions and genuine expertise. The paradox deepens when we consider that overcoming the curse requires experts to deliberately handicap their own cognitive abilities. They must suppress their natural tendency to use efficient, expert-level thinking and instead simulate the slower, more deliberate cognitive processes of novices. This is cognitively demanding and often feels unnatural, like a virtuoso pianist trying to play at beginner level. But perhaps the most profound implication of the curse of knowledge is what it reveals about the nature of expertise itself. We typically think of knowledge as additive. The more we know, the better equipped we are to handle any situation. The curse suggests that knowledge is also transformative, fundamentally changing how we perceive and process information. Expertise doesn't just add to our capabilities, it rewires our cognitive architecture in ways that create new blind spots. This mind game forces us to reconsider the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. True wisdom might involve not just acquiring expertise, but maintaining the ability to bridge expertise gaps through effective communication. The most skilled teachers and leaders are those who can overcome their curse, translating complex ideas into accessible language without losing essential meaning. The paradox also highlights the importance of cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and simulate another person's mental state. In our increasingly specialized world, where expertise is more valuable than ever, the ability to overcome the curse of knowledge becomes a crucial meta-skill. It's not enough to be an expert. We must also be expert at sharing our expertise. Understanding this curse offers a pathway to more effective communication across knowledge gaps. By recognizing that our expertise creates blind spots, we can develop strategies to bridge these gaps, using analogies, providing context, checking for understanding, and remembering what it felt like to be a beginner. The curse of knowledge, once recognized, becomes a challenge to overcome rather than a prison that isolates us from others. 4. The planning fallacy. Imagine you're a student with a term paper due in 2 weeks. You estimate it will take you about 10 hours to complete research, outline, writing, editing. It seems reasonable, even generous. 2 weeks later, you're frantically typing at 3 a.m., having spent 25 hours on what you thought would be a 10-hour project. Welcome to the planning fallacy, a cognitive bias so pervasive that it affects everyone from college students to mega project managers planning billion-dollar infrastructure. The planning fallacy reveals a fascinating paradox about human temporal perception. We consistently underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits, even when we have extensive experience with similar past projects. This isn't just poor estimation. It's a systematic bias that persists despite repeated evidence of our temporal miscalculations. The phenomenon was first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their groundbreaking 1979 research on decision-making under uncertainty. They discovered that when people plan future projects, they engage in what psychologists call focusing illusion, concentrating on the specific scenario they're planning while ignoring the broader context of their past experiences and potential complications. The mechanics of this mind game are both elegant and maddening. When we plan, we naturally focus on the ideal scenario, what the project will look like when everything goes according to plan. We imagine ourselves working efficiently, encountering no unexpected obstacles, and having no competing priorities. This inside view feels concrete and vivid, making it seem more probable than it actually is. Meanwhile, our brains systematically ignore the outside view, the statistical reality of how similar projects have actually unfolded in the past. Even when we're aware that previous projects took longer than expected, we convince ourselves that this time will be different. This time, we'll be more disciplined, more focused, more prepared. This optimistic bias isn't just wishful thinking, it's a fundamental feature of how our brains process temporal information. The planning fallacy operates across scales from the mundane to the monumental. Students consistently underestimate how long assignments will take, despite having completed dozens of similar assignments. Software developers are notorious for underestimating project timelines, leading to the industry joke that you should always multiply initial estimates by 3. But the most spectacular examples occur in large-scale projects. The Sydney Opera House was planned to take 4 years and cost $7 million. It actually took 14 years and cost $102 million. Research reveals that only about 45% of students finish projects by their 99% confidence deadline. This statistic is particularly striking because it suggests that even when people are trying to be extremely conservative in their estimates, they still fall victim to the fallacy. The bias isn't just about being mildly optimistic. It's about a fundamental misunderstanding of how time, complexity, and uncertainty interact. The paradox deepens when we consider that the planning fallacy persists even among experts who should know better. Experienced project managers, who have witnessed countless projects exceed their timelines, still produce optimistic estimates for new projects. This suggests that the bias isn't simply about lacking experience, it's about how our cognitive architecture handles future planning. The psychological mechanisms underlying this fallacy are complex and interrelated. Our brains are prediction machines, constantly trying to anticipate the future, but they're optimized for best-case scenarios rather than realistic assessments. This optimism bias served our ancestors well in environments where taking action despite uncertainty was often better than paralysis. But in our modern world of complex projects and tight deadlines, this ancestral programming creates systematic problems. The planning fallacy also reveals something profound about the nature of time itself, or at least our perception of it. We experience the present moment as concrete and immediate, while the future feels abstract and malleable. This temporal asymmetry makes us overconfident in our ability to control future events, while underestimating the challenges that await us. Understanding this mind game has practical implications for how we approach planning and decision-making. Effective strategies for overcoming the planning fallacy include reference class forecasting, looking at how similar past projects actually unfolded, pre-mortem analysis, imagining what could go wrong, and building in buffer time for unexpected complications. The paradox forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We are fundamentally optimistic creatures living in a world of uncertainty and complexity. This optimism drives us to take on ambitious projects and pursue challenging goals. But it also sets us up for frustration and failure when reality doesn't match our expectations. Perhaps the most profound insight from the planning fallacy is that it reveals the tension between two different modes of thinking: the experiential system that learns from past events and the narrative system that constructs hopeful stories about the future. The fallacy occurs when our narrative system overrides the lessons of our experiential system, creating a persistent gap between expectation and reality. 5. Asch conformity. Picture yourself sitting in a psychology experiment, surrounded by 7 other participants. The researcher shows you a simple task: match the length of a line to one of 3 comparison lines. The answer is obvious, laughably obvious. Line A is clearly the correct match. But then, something impossible happens. The first participant confidently states that line C is correct. The second agrees. The third. The fourth. By the time it's your turn, 6 people have unanimously chosen what you know to be the wrong answer. What do you do? This is the setup for one of psychology's most chilling experiments, Solomon Asch's conformity studies. The results reveal a disturbing truth about human nature. We will literally deny the evidence of our own eyes to avoid standing alone against group consensus. The Asch experiments conducted in the 1950s exposed a fundamental paradox of human cognition. We are simultaneously independent thinking beings and social creatures desperate for acceptance. When these two aspects of our nature conflict, social pressure often wins, even when the stakes are seemingly trivial and the correct answer is objectively clear. The statistics are sobering. In Asch's original experiments, 75% of participants conformed to the group's incorrect judgment at least once. On critical trials where the group unanimously gave wrong answers, 32% of participants conformed. These weren't weak-willed individuals or people with poor eyesight. They were ordinary people whose perceptual judgment was overwhelmed by social pressure. The deeper paradox lies in how this conformity operates. Asch discovered that conformity wasn't just about external compliance. Many participants genuinely began to doubt their own perception. They didn't just pretend to see what the group saw, they actually started to question what they were seeing. This suggests that group pressure can literally alter our perception of reality, not just our willingness to voice our opinions. The psychological mechanisms underlying conformity are both fascinating and frightening. Asch identified 2 primary drivers: normative social influence, the desire to be liked and accepted, and informational social influence, the assumption that others possess superior knowledge. When faced with unanimous group opposition, our brains activate both systems simultaneously, creating overwhelming pressure to conform. The power of this mind game becomes even more apparent when we consider what breaks it. In variations of the experiment, Asch found that having just one ally, one other person who gave the correct answer, reduced conformity rates to only 5%. This suggests that conformity isn't just about being outnumbered, it's about being isolated. A single dissenting voice can shatter the illusion of consensus and give others permission to trust their own judgment. The Asch experiments reveal conformity as a double-edged sword. While excessive conformity can lead to poor decisions and moral failures, some degree of conformity is essential for social functioning. We need to be able to coordinate our behavior with others, follow social norms, and sometimes defer to expertise. The challenge lies in knowing when to conform and when to resist. The implications extend far beyond laboratory settings. The Asch effect helps explain how fashion trends spread, how workplace cultures develop, and how political movements gain momentum. It illuminates the psychology behind groupthink in corporate boardrooms, where dissenting opinions are suppressed in favor of false consensus. It also provides insight into more troubling phenomena, such as how ordinary people can participate in mob behavior or remain silent in the face of injustice. The paradox of conformity forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about free will and individual autonomy. If our judgments can be so easily swayed by group pressure, how much of our thinking is truly independent? Are we making our own choices, or are we simply reflecting the consensus of our social environment? Modern neuroscience has begun to illuminate the biological basis of conformity. Brain imaging studies show that when people conform to group judgments, areas associated with perception and judgment show reduced activity, while areas associated with social cognition become more active. This suggests that conformity isn't just a conscious decision, it's a neurological process that can literally change how we process information. The Asch experiments also reveal the importance of social courage, the willingness to stand alone against group pressure when necessary. This courage isn't just about being contrarian, it's about maintaining intellectual integrity in the face of social pressure. In our increasingly polarized world, where echo chambers and filter bubbles amplify group consensus, the ability to think independently becomes even more crucial. Understanding conformity pressure offers strategies for resistance. Knowing that unanimity is key to conformity's power, we can seek out diverse perspectives and create environments where dissent is valued. We can also practice what psychologists call minority influence, the ability to introduce new ideas and perspectives that can eventually shift group consensus. The paradox of conformity ultimately reveals that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose individual cognition is deeply intertwined with group dynamics. We cannot think in isolation from our social environment, but we can become more aware of how that environment shapes our thinking. By understanding the power of conformity, we can make more conscious choices about when to go along with the group and when to trust our own judgment. The Asch experiments stand as a powerful reminder that independence of thought requires constant vigilance. In a world where social media algorithms create artificial consensus and polarization makes dissent costly, the lessons of these experiments are more relevant than ever. They challenge us to be not just independent thinkers, but courageous ones, willing to stand alone when truth demands it. 6. The bystander effect. Picture this haunting scenario. A woman is attacked on a busy city street while dozens of people walk by, each assuming someone else will help. This isn't fiction, it's the chilling reality of the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how the presence of others can paradoxically reduce our likelihood of helping someone in need. The bystander effect exposes a fundamental contradiction in human nature. We are social creatures who evolved to cooperate and help one another. Yet the very presence of other people can trigger psychological mechanisms that inhibit our natural helping instincts. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any individual is to intervene, a paradox that challenges our assumptions about human compassion and social responsibility. This mind game was first systematically studied by John Darley and Bibb Latané following the infamous 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York, where 38 witnesses allegedly failed to help or call police. Their groundbreaking research revealed that this wasn't a story of urban callousness, but rather a predictable psychological phenomenon that affects virtually everyone under the right conditions. The mechanics of the bystander effect operate through two primary psychological processes: diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when the presence of others dilutes our sense of personal obligation to act. In a crowd, we unconsciously assume that someone else will take charge, that someone else is more qualified to help, or that someone else has already called for assistance. This mental calculus happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness. Pluralistic ignorance compounds this effect by creating a false consensus about the seriousness of the situation. When we're uncertain about whether help is needed, we look to others for cues about appropriate behavior. But if everyone else appears calm and uninvolved, we interpret this as evidence that the situation isn't serious, even when everyone else is making the same calculation. This creates a feedback loop where collective inaction reinforces itself. The experimental evidence is both precise and disturbing. In Daly and Latané's classic 1968 study, participants believed they were discussing personal problems with other students over an intercom system. When one participant appeared to have a seizure, 85% of those who believed they were the only witness intervened within the first minute. But when participants thought 4 other people were also listening, only 31% intervened, and those who did help took significantly longer to act. The paradox deepens when we consider that this effect occurs even in situations where helping would be easy and safe. In smoke-filled room experiments, individuals alone reported the emergency within 2 minutes 75% of the time, while groups of 3 took an average of 6 minutes, with many never reporting the smoke at all. The presence of others doesn't just reduce helping behavior, it can literally prevent people from recognizing emergencies. This mind game reveals something profound about human social cognition. Our behavior is not determined solely by our individual values and intentions, but by the complex interplay between our psychology and our social environment. We like to think of ourselves as moral agents who would naturally help others in need. But the bystander effect shows that our actions are heavily influenced by situational factors we may not even consciously recognize. The implications extend far beyond emergency situations. The bystander effect helps explain why workplace harassment can persist even when many people witness it, why cyberbullying occurs in front of hundreds of online observers, and why social movements often struggle to gain momentum despite widespread sympathy for their cause. It illuminates the psychology behind somebody else's problem syndrome and the tendency to assume that others will take action when we don't. Modern technology has created new dimensions of the bystander effect. Social media platforms can amplify the phenomenon by creating the illusion that millions of others are witnessing the same injustice, leading to a digital diffusion of responsibility. The ease of sharing content can paradoxically reduce the likelihood of meaningful action, as people substitute symbolic gestures for substantive intervention. The neuroscience of the bystander effect reveals fascinating insights about moral decision-making. Brain imaging studies show that when people witness emergencies in group settings, areas associated with empathy and moral reasoning show reduced activation compared to when they witness the same situations alone. This suggests that the presence of others doesn't just influence our behavior, it literally changes how our brains process moral information. But understanding the bystander effect also provides pathways for overcoming it. Research has shown that the effect can be dramatically reduced through simple interventions. Making people aware of the phenomenon, assigning specific roles and responsibilities, and creating accountability mechanisms can all help break the cycle of collective inaction. Emergency responders are trained to point to specific individuals and give direct commands. You in the blue shirt, call 911. The paradox of the bystander effect ultimately reveals that moral behavior is not just about individual character, it's about understanding and designing social systems that support ethical action. In our increasingly connected world, where we are constantly surrounded by others, both physically and digitally, the ability to overcome bystander psychology becomes crucial for maintaining a compassionate society. This mind game challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about moral responsibility in group settings. It suggests that true moral courage isn't just about having good intentions. It's about understanding the psychological barriers that prevent us from acting on those intentions and developing strategies to overcome them. By recognizing the bystander effect, we can become more aware of our own susceptibility to collective inaction and more intentional about taking responsibility when action is needed. 7. Social proof. Imagine walking down a busy street and noticing a crowd of people all looking up at a building. Without thinking, you find yourself stopping and craning your neck to see what has captured their attention. There might be nothing there at all, but the mere act of others looking up compels you to do the same. Welcome to the power of social proof, one of the most pervasive and influential psychological phenomena shaping human behavior. Social proof operates on a deceptively simple principle. When we're uncertain about how to behave in a situation, we look to others for guidance, assuming they possess knowledge we lack. This cognitive shortcut, known as heuristic processing, allows us to make quick decisions in ambiguous situations by copying the actions of those around us. But this seemingly rational strategy creates a psychological vulnerability that can be exploited in ways that would astound our ancestors. The paradox of social proof lies in its simultaneous rationality and irrationality. From an evolutionary perspective, following the crowd made perfect sense. If everyone else was running from a predator, it was wise to run too, even if you hadn't seen the threat yourself. This ancient wisdom served our ancestors well in environments where conformity often meant survival. But in our modern world, this same mechanism can lead us astray, causing us to follow crowds toward decisions that serve neither our individual interests nor collective well-being. The mechanics of social proof operate through what psychologists call informational social influence, the assumption that others' actions reflect superior knowledge about the correct course of action. When we see others behaving in a particular way, our brains automatically calculate that they must know something we don't. This isn't conscious reasoning. It's an automatic cognitive process that happens below the threshold of awareness. Robert Cialdini's groundbreaking research revealed just how powerfully social proof shapes behavior across domains. In his famous hotel towel study, guests were far more likely to reuse towels when told that the majority of guests in this room reuse their towels compared to standard environmental messages. The mere knowledge that others had engaged in the behavior made it seem more appropriate and desirable. This effect increased towel reuse by 26%, a significant change from a simple information frame. The cascading nature of social proof creates what economists call information cascades, situations where people sequentially follow the actions of those before them, potentially leading entire groups away from optimal decisions. Consider restaurant selection. An empty restaurant might serve excellent food, but its emptiness signals to potential customers that others have judged it poorly. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where good restaurants fail due to lack of initial customers, while mediocre restaurants succeed simply because they appear popular. The digital age has amplified social proof to unprecedented levels. Social media metrics, likes, shares, comments, followers, serve as quantified social proof that influences everything from political opinions to consumer choices. The number of views on a video, the rating of a product, or the popularity of a social media post creates artificial social proof that can drive massive behavioral changes. What once required physical presence and direct observation now operates through digital signals that can be manipulated and manufactured. The most insidious aspect of social proof is how it can override our individual judgment and values. The famous laugh track phenomenon demonstrates this perfectly. Television shows use recorded laughter to trigger social proof, making audiences laugh at jokes they might not find funny in isolation. The artificial social signal convinces our brains that others are finding the content humorous, which makes us more likely to laugh ourselves. Financial markets provide dramatic examples of social proof in action. Investment bubbles often form when investors see others buying certain assets and assume they must know something valuable. The dot-com bubble of the 1990s and the housing bubble of the 2000s were both driven in part by social proof. Investors poured money into overvalued assets because they saw others doing the same. The cascading effect created artificial demand that temporarily sustained unsustainable prices. The power of social proof becomes even more apparent when we consider its absence. Products or ideas that lack social proof struggle to gain traction, regardless of their inherent merit. This creates a cold start problem where genuinely valuable innovations fail to spread simply because they lack initial social validation. The paradox is that sometimes the best ideas are the ones that haven't been tried yet, but social proof biases us toward the familiar and popular. Understanding social proof reveals both its dangers and its potential for positive change. Charitable organizations have learned to publish donor lists, not just to recognize contributors, but to create social proof that encourages additional donations. Public health campaigns use social proof by highlighting how many people engage in healthy behaviors rather than focusing on the prevalence of unhealthy ones. Environmental initiatives succeed when they emphasize that most people in your neighborhood recycle, rather than that recycling is good for the environment. The neuroscience of social proof shows how deeply embedded this mechanism is in our cognitive architecture. Brain imaging studies reveal that when people observe others making choices, the same neural networks activate as when they make similar choices themselves. This suggests that social proof isn't just about conscious imitation, it's about unconscious neural simulation of others' decision-making processes. The digital manipulation of social proof raises profound questions about authenticity and autonomy in our connected age. When likes can be bought, reviews can be fabricated, and viral content can be artificially promoted, the social signals we use to guide our behavior become increasingly unreliable. This creates a crisis of social epistemology. How do we know what others really think when the signals of social proof can be manufactured? The paradox of social proof ultimately reveals that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose individual decision-making is deeply intertwined with collective behavior. We cannot think in isolation from our social environment, but we can become more aware of how that environment shapes our thinking. By understanding the power of social proof, we can make more conscious choices about when to follow the crowd and when to trust our own judgment. This mind game challenges us to develop what we might call social intelligence, the ability to distinguish between genuine social proof and manufactured signals, to recognize when conformity serves our interests and when it doesn't, and to understand how our own actions contribute to the social proof that influences others. In a world where social signals are increasingly digitized and manipulable, this intelligence becomes essential for navigating modern life with wisdom and autonomy. 8. Groupthink. Picture the most important decision makers in American government gathered in a room, all brilliant minds, all experienced leaders, all committed to protecting their nation's interests. The year is 1961, and they're planning what will become known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Despite clear warning signs and significant risks, not one person voices serious dissent. The result? One of the most spectacular foreign policy disasters in American history. This is groupthink in action, a psychological phenomenon that turns our greatest strength, our ability to work together, into our greatest weakness. Groupthink reveals a chilling paradox about human collaboration. The very qualities that make groups effective, cohesion, loyalty, shared purpose, can also make them dangerously irrational. When groups become too harmonious, too unified in their thinking, they lose the ability to critically evaluate their own decisions. The desire to maintain group unity overrides the need for careful analysis, leading to catastrophic failures that might have been prevented by a single dissenting voice. Irving Janis, who coined the term in 1971, identified groupthink as a psychological phenomenon that occurs when the desire for harmony within a group results in dysfunctional decision-making. The group prioritizes consensus over accuracy, loyalty over logic, and comfort over critical thinking. Members suppress their doubts, ignore contradictory evidence, and convince themselves that their group is inherently moral and infallible. The mechanics of groupthink operate through 8 distinct symptoms that Janis organized into 3 categories. First, groups develop an overestimation of their own capabilities, manifesting as illusions of unanimity and beliefs in the group's inherent morality. Second, they exhibit closed-mindedness, including stereotyping of outsiders and rationalization of warning signs. Third, They create pressure toward uniformity through self-censorship, direct pressure on dissenters, and the emergence of mind guards who protect the group from contradictory information. The psychological appeal of groupthink is understandable. It feels good to be part of a unified, harmonious group where everyone agrees and works toward common goals. The social bonds formed in these cohesive groups create powerful emotional rewards that make dissent feel not just uncomfortable, but treasonous. Members begin to define their identity through their group membership, making criticism of group decisions feel like criticism of themselves. The Bay of Pigs invasion exemplifies classic groupthink dynamics. President Kennedy's advisory team, despite their individual expertise and intelligence, fell into a pattern of mutual reinforcement that prevented critical analysis. They dismissed intelligence reports about the strength of Castro's forces, ignored warnings about the invasion's feasibility, and convinced themselves that the operation would be quick and successful. The desire to maintain group cohesion prevented anyone from asking the hard questions that might have revealed the plan's fundamental flaws. The Challenger space shuttle disaster provides another tragic example of groupthink in action. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had serious concerns about O-ring performance in cold weather, but these concerns were overridden by group pressure to maintain the launch schedule. The organizational culture at NASA had become so focused on consensus and can-do attitudes that dissenting voices were marginalized. The result was a preventable disaster that killed 7 astronauts and damaged public trust in the space program. Corporate boardrooms are particularly susceptible to groupthink, especially when led by charismatic CEOs who discourage dissent. The 2008 financial crisis revealed how major banks and financial institutions had fallen into groupthink patterns, convincing themselves that housing prices would never fall and that complex financial instruments had eliminated risk. The shared assumptions and mutual reinforcement within these organizations prevented the critical questioning that might have revealed the systemic risks they were creating. The digital age has created new forms of groupthink through social media, echo chambers, and algorithmic filtering. Online communities can develop extreme consensus on controversial topics, with dissenting voices quickly silenced or driven away. The speed and scale of digital communication can accelerate groupthink processes, allowing false consensus to spread rapidly across large networks of people who never meet in person. The neuroscience of groupthink reveals how group dynamics can literally change brain function. When people are in highly cohesive groups, areas of the brain associated with critical thinking and independent judgment show reduced activity, while areas associated with social bonding and conformity become more active. This suggests that groupthink isn't just about social pressure, it's about fundamental changes in how our brains process information in group settings. The paradox of groupthink is that the very qualities we value in teams, trust, loyalty, shared vision, can become toxic when taken to extremes. High-performing groups need some degree of cohesion and shared purpose, but they also need what psychologists call constructive controversy, the ability to challenge ideas, question assumptions, and explore alternative perspectives without threatening group unity. Understanding groupthink provides strategies for prevention. Effective leaders can assign devil's advocate roles, bring in outside experts to challenge group assumptions, and create psychological safety for dissenting voices. They can structure decision-making processes to encourage critical thinking and avoid premature consensus. Most importantly, they can model intellectual humility by acknowledging uncertainty and encouraging others to question their ideas. The antidote to groupthink isn't the absence of group cohesion, it's the cultivation of what researchers call task conflict, while minimizing relationship conflict. Groups need to be able to disagree about ideas and strategies while maintaining respect and trust for one another as individuals. This requires sophisticated social skills and emotional intelligence that many groups lack. The study of groupthink also reveals the importance of diversity in group composition. Homogeneous groups are more susceptible to groupthink because members share similar backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. Diverse groups, while potentially more difficult to manage, are more likely to generate the cognitive diversity needed to avoid groupthink traps. The phenomenon of groupthink ultimately challenges us to reconsider what we mean by effective teamwork. True collaboration isn't about achieving harmony at all costs. It's about combining individual expertise and perspectives to make better decisions than any individual could make alone. This requires groups to embrace what researchers call productive discomfort, the willingness to tolerate disagreement and uncertainty in service of better outcomes. In our increasingly complex world, where many challenges require coordinated group action, understanding and preventing groupthink becomes essential. The stakes are simply too high to allow the comfort of false consensus to override the necessity of critical thinking. By recognizing the signs of groupthink and implementing strategies to prevent it, we can harness the power of group collaboration while avoiding its most dangerous pitfalls. 9. The foot in the door technique. Imagine a stranger approaches you on the street and asks if you'd be willing to put a large, unsightly billboard supporting safe driving in your front yard. Your immediate response? Probably a firm no. But what if the same stranger first asked you to display a small window sticker with the same message? You might agree to that modest request. And if you do, you've just taken the first step up a psychological staircase that makes you dramatically more likely to agree to that billboard later. Welcome to the foot in the door technique, a compliance strategy that exploits our deep psychological need for consistency. The foot in the door technique reveals a fascinating paradox about human behavior. Once we agree to a small request, we become psychologically invested in maintaining consistency with that initial commitment, making us far more likely to agree to larger related requests. This isn't just about social pressure or reciprocity. It's about how our brains maintain a coherent sense of self-identity through behavioral consistency. The technique gets its name from the door-to-door sales practice of literally getting a foot in the door. Once the salesperson could prevent the door from closing, they had a much better chance of making a sale. But the psychological mechanism goes much deeper than this metaphor suggests. It taps into fundamental aspects of human cognition and self-perception that operate automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness. Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser's groundbreaking 1966 study at Stanford University provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. They approached homeowners with a request to install a large, ugly, "Drive carefully" sign in their front yards. Only 17% agreed to this reasonable but inconvenient request. But when researchers first asked a different group to display a small 3-inch "Be a Safe Driver" sign in their windows, which 76% agreed to, and then returned 2 weeks later with the large sign request, 76% agreed to the billboard. The initial small commitment had quadrupled compliance with the larger request. The psychological mechanisms underlying the foot in the door technique are rooted in what Leon Festinger called cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that arises when our actions and beliefs are inconsistent. When we agree to a small request, we begin to see ourselves as the kind of person who supports that cause or engages in that behavior. This self-perception change creates internal pressure to act consistently with our new self-image. The technique works through a process psychologists call commitment and consistency. Once we've made a commitment, even a small one, we experience psychological pressure to align our future actions with that commitment. This pressure operates through multiple channels. We want to appear consistent to others, we want to feel consistent to ourselves, and we want to reduce the cognitive dissonance that would arise from acting inconsistently. The power of this mind game lies in its ability to transform identity through action. The person who agrees to display a small safe driving sign begins to see themselves as someone who cares about traffic safety. This identity shift makes them more receptive to larger requests related to the same cause. The technique doesn't just change behavior, it changes how people think about themselves. Charitable organizations have mastered the foot in the door technique through carefully designed escalation strategies. They might start by asking for signatures on a petition, then request a small donation, then ask for volunteer time, and finally solicit major gifts. Each step builds psychological commitment that makes the next request more likely to succeed. The American Cancer Society's Light Up a Life campaign exemplifies this approach. starting with small remembrance donations and gradually building to major philanthropic commitments. Political campaigns use similar strategies to build supporter engagement. They might start by asking people to sign up for email updates, then request social media shares, then ask for volunteer hours, and finally solicit campaign contributions. Each level of engagement increases psychological investment in the campaign's success, creating a ladder of escalating commitment. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The initial request must be large enough to create meaningful commitment, but small enough to ensure high compliance rates. The requests must be related to the same cause or identity, and there should be sufficient time between requests for the initial commitment to influence self-perception. Most importantly, the initial compliance must feel voluntary rather than coerced. The digital age has created new opportunities for implementing the foot-in-the-door technique. Social media platforms use micro-commitments like likes, shares, and comments to build user engagement. Each small action increases psychological investment in the platform, making users more likely to spend time and attention on the service. Dating apps use similar strategies, starting with simple swipes and building to more substantial commitments like profile completion and message exchanges. The neuroscience of the foot-in-the-door technique reveals how commitment changes brain function. When people make commitments, areas of the brain associated with self-control and future planning become more active. This suggests that commitments don't just change how we think about ourselves, they literally change how our brains process future decisions. The ethical implications of the foot-in-the-door technique are complex and context-dependent. When used to encourage positive behaviors like charitable giving, environmental conservation, or health promotion, the technique can serve pro-social goals. But when used manipulatively to exploit people's psychological vulnerabilities, it becomes a tool for unethical influence. Understanding this technique provides insights into both persuasion and resistance. Recognizing when others are using foot-in-the-door strategies can help us make more conscious decisions about our commitments. We can also use the technique ethically to encourage positive behaviors in ourselves and others, understanding that small initial commitments can lead to significant long-term changes. The foot-in-the-door technique ultimately reveals something profound about human nature. We are consistency-seeking creatures who use our past actions to guide our future decisions. This creates opportunities for positive change through incremental commitment, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can make more conscious choices about the commitments we make and the identities we construct through our actions. The paradox of the foot-in-the-door technique is that it simultaneously reveals our psychological vulnerabilities and provides a pathway for positive change. The same mechanisms that make us susceptible to manipulation also allow us to use small commitments to build beneficial habits and behaviors. The key is developing the wisdom to recognize when these mechanisms are being used ethically versus exploitatively, and to use them consciously in our own lives to achieve our authentic goals. 10. The door-in-the-face technique. In the face. Imagine a college student approaches you on campus with an unusual request. Would you be willing to volunteer as a counselor at a juvenile detention center for 2 hours every week for the next 2 years? The commitment seems enormous, 104 hours of your life. You politely decline. But then the student makes a much smaller request. Would you be willing to spend just 2 hours chaperoning a group of these kids on a trip to the zoo? Suddenly, this modest request seems quite reasonable. If you agree, you've just experienced the door-in-the-face technique, a compliance strategy that exploits our deep psychological tendency toward reciprocity and fairness. The door-in-the-face technique reveals a counterintuitive truth about human psychology. Sometimes the best way to get what you want is to first ask for something you know you won't get. By starting with an unreasonably large request that will almost certainly be rejected, you create psychological conditions that make a subsequent, more reasonable request far more likely to succeed. This technique inverts our normal assumptions about negotiation and reveals how our brains process requests in relative rather than absolute terms. The psychological mechanisms underlying this technique are rooted in what Robert Cialdini identified as the reciprocity principle, one of the most powerful drivers of human social behavior. When someone makes a concession by reducing their request, we feel obligated to reciprocate with our own concession by agreeing to the smaller request. This happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness, as our brains calculate social debts and obligations. Robert Cialdini's seminal 1975 study provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. Research assistants approached college students with a request to spend 2 hours per week for 2 years counseling juvenile delinquents. Predictably, no one agreed to this enormous commitment. But when the same assistants followed up with a much smaller request, spending 2 hours chaperoning a zoo trip, 50% of students agreed. In contrast, when students were only asked about the zoo trip without the prior large request, only 17% agreed. The initial door-in-the-face rejection had tripled compliance with the actual desired request. The technique works through multiple psychological channels simultaneously. First, the contrast effect makes the second request seem smaller and more reasonable by comparison. After being asked to commit 104 hours, a 2-hour commitment feels trivial. Second, the reciprocity principle kicks in when the requester concedes to the smaller request. We feel obligated to reciprocate with our own concession. Third, the technique can generate guilt about rejecting the initial request, making us more susceptible to the follow-up. The power of the door-in-the-face technique lies in its ability to reframe the entire negotiation context. Instead of evaluating the second request on its own merits, we evaluate it relative to the first request. This cognitive anchoring effect is so powerful that it can make objectively unreasonable requests seem not just acceptable, but generous. Skilled negotiators have used variations of this technique for centuries. Labor unions might start with extreme demands they know will be rejected, then compromise to their actual desired terms. Sales professionals might begin with premium packages they don't expect to sell, then offer simplified versions that seem like bargains by comparison. Even children instinctively use this technique when they ask for something outrageous, then settle for what they actually wanted all along. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The initial request must be large enough to create meaningful contrast, but not so outrageous as to seem insincere or manipulative. The requests must be made by the same person and be related to the same cause or organization. Most importantly, the initial request must be perceived as genuine rather than obviously strategic. The real estate industry provides fascinating examples of door-in-the-face dynamics. Agents might show buyers overpriced properties first, making their actual target properties seem reasonably priced by comparison. Car salespeople use similar strategies, starting with fully loaded models before compromising to mid-range options that include their desired profit margins. The digital age has created new contexts for door-in-the-face techniques. Subscription services might initially promote annual plans, then offer monthly plans that seem more reasonable by comparison. Software companies use freemium models where premium features are priced high, making basic paid subscriptions seem like reasonable compromises. The neuroscience of reciprocity reveals why the door-in-the-face technique is so effective. Brain imaging studies show that when people perceive concessions from others, areas associated with reward processing and social bonding become active. This suggests that reciprocity isn't just a conscious social strategy, it's a fundamental neural response to perceived fairness and cooperation. The technique also exploits what psychologists call perceptual contrast, our tendency to evaluate options relative to available alternatives rather than in absolute terms. When the initial request creates a high anchor point, subsequent requests are evaluated relative to this anchor, making them seem more reasonable than they would in isolation. Understanding the door-in-the-face technique provides insights into both persuasion and resistance. Recognizing when others are using this strategy can help us evaluate requests more objectively, focusing on the absolute merits of what's being asked rather than being swayed by contrasts and reciprocity pressure. We can also use the technique ethically in our own negotiations, understanding that strategic concessions can create win-win outcomes. The ethical implications of the door-in-the-face technique are nuanced. When used in genuine negotiations, where both parties benefit from finding mutually acceptable terms, the technique can facilitate productive compromise. But when used manipulatively to exploit people's psychological vulnerabilities, it becomes a tool for unethical influence. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human fairness and reciprocity. Our brains are constantly calculating social debts and obligations, automatically triggering reciprocity responses when we perceive others making concessions. This suggests that fairness isn't just a moral principle, it's a fundamental cognitive process that shapes how we evaluate social interactions. The door-in-the-face technique ultimately demonstrates that human decision-making is contextual rather than absolute. We don't evaluate requests in isolation, but relative to our recent experiences and expectations. This creates opportunities for ethical influence, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The paradox of this technique is that it simultaneously reveals our psychological sophistication and our cognitive limitations. Our capacity for reciprocity and fairness represents evolved social intelligence that enables complex cooperation. But these same mechanisms can be hijacked to influence our behavior in ways that may not serve our best interests. Understanding these dynamics allows us to navigate social interactions more consciously and ethically. 11. The scarcity principle. Imagine walking into a store and seeing two identical items on the shelf. One has a simple price tag, while the other displays only 3 left in stock. Which one captures your attention? Which one suddenly seems more valuable? If you're like most people, the limited availability item not only grabs your focus, but actually appears more desirable. Welcome to the scarcity principle, a psychological phenomenon that transforms our perception of value through the simple suggestion that something might not be available forever. The scarcity principle reveals a fundamental paradox of human desire. We don't just want things because they're good, we want them more intensely when they're rare or difficult to obtain. This isn't rational economic behavior where value is determined by utility. It's a cognitive bias that can make us prize mediocre limited editions over superior unlimited alternatives. The mere suggestion of scarcity activates powerful psychological mechanisms that can override our logical evaluation of worth. The psychological roots of scarcity effects run deep in our evolutionary history. Our ancestors lived in environments where resources were genuinely limited. Food, shelter, mates, and territory were all scarce commodities that required competition to obtain. Those who could quickly recognize and secure limited resources were more likely to survive and reproduce. This ancient programming remains embedded in our modern psychology, even when we're dealing with manufactured scarcity in abundant societies. The mechanics of scarcity work through multiple psychological channels. First, loss aversion makes us fear missing out on opportunities more than we value gaining equivalent benefits. The pain of losing something feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining it, making limited time offers psychologically compelling. Second, scarcity serves as a heuristic for quality. We assume that popular or hard-to-get items must be valuable, or they wouldn't be in such demand. Stephen Wirtschall's groundbreaking 1975 study provided clear evidence of how scarcity affects perception. Participants were given cookies to taste from jars containing either 10 or 2 cookies. The cookies were identical, but those from the nearly empty jar were rated as significantly more attractive and valuable. The scarcity made the exact same cookies taste better, demonstrating how availability affects our actual sensory experience. The scarcity principle operates through what psychologists call reactance theory. When our freedom to choose is threatened, we experience psychological reactance that makes us want the restricted option even more. This explains why limited edition products often sell better than their regular counterparts, even when the only difference is the label. The suggestion that our choice might be restricted triggers an unconscious rebellion that increases desire. Modern marketing has weaponized scarcity through sophisticated techniques that create artificial urgency. Flash sales with countdown timers, limited quantity messages, and exclusive membership offers all exploit our psychological vulnerability to scarcity. E-commerce sites show only 2 left in stock messages, and other customers are viewing this item, alerts to create competitive pressure that drives immediate purchases. The digital age has amplified scarcity effects through social media and online platforms. Viral content spreads partly because of perceived scarcity, the fear of missing out on cultural moments that might disappear from collective attention. Dating apps exploit scarcity by showing limited profiles and suggesting that matches might disappear if not pursued quickly. Social media platforms create artificial scarcity through features like stories that disappear after 24 hours. The neuroscience of scarcity reveals fascinating insights about how our brains process limited resources. When people encounter scarce items, brain regions associated with reward anticipation and loss aversion become highly active. This suggests that scarcity doesn't just influence our thinking, it triggers fundamental neural responses that evolve to help us compete for limited resources. The principle becomes even more powerful when combined with social proof. When we see others pursuing scarce items, it validates both the item's desirability and the urgency of acting quickly. This creates buying frenzies, where people compete for items they might not even want in normal circumstances. Black Friday sales exemplify this phenomenon, where the combination of limited time, limited quantities, and social competition creates irrational purchasing behavior. The paradox of scarcity is that it often creates value where none existed before. A painting by an unknown artist becomes more valuable when it's described as one of only 5 remaining works. A wine tastes better when it's from a limited vintage. A social media post seems more important when it's from a verified account. The scarcity itself becomes a component of value, independent of the item's inherent qualities. Understanding scarcity provides both protection against manipulation and insights into human motivation. We can recognize when scarcity is being artificially created to influence our behavior, and we can use scarcity ethically to motivate positive actions. Environmental conservation campaigns often emphasize the scarcity of natural resources to motivate protection efforts. Educational programs highlight the limited availability of opportunities to encourage student engagement. The scarcity principle ultimately reveals that human value perception is contextual and comparative rather than absolute. We don't evaluate things in isolation, but relative to their availability and accessibility. This creates opportunities for ethical influence, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The key is developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine scarcity that reflects real value and artificial scarcity designed to manipulate our psychological responses. 12. Intermittent reinforcement. Picture a person sitting in front of a slot machine at 3 a.m., feeding coins into a device that statistically guarantees they'll lose money. They've been playing for hours, losing steadily, yet they can't stop. They're not stupid, weak-willed, or irrational. They're experiencing one of the most powerful psychological phenomena ever discovered: intermittent reinforcement. This mind game reveals how unpredictable rewards can create more compulsive behavior than predictable ones, turning uncertainty into a form of psychological addiction. Intermittent reinforcement exposes a profound paradox about human motivation. We don't just want rewards, we become obsessed with rewards we can't predict. A behavior that's occasionally rewarded becomes more persistent than one that's always rewarded. This counterintuitive finding challenges our basic assumptions about motivation and reveals how our brains are wired to respond to uncertainty in ways that can be both adaptive and destructive. The psychological mechanisms underlying intermittent reinforcement were first systematically studied by B.F. Skinner in the 1930s. His experiments with rats and pigeons revealed that animals would press levers or peck buttons more obsessively when rewards were delivered on unpredictable schedules rather than predictable ones. When rewards came regularly, animals would work just enough to get them. But when rewards were unpredictable, animals would work frantically, unable to determine the correct amount of effort needed. The human brain's response to intermittent reinforcement is rooted in our dopamine system, the neural circuitry that processes reward and motivation. Dopamine neurons fire most intensely not when we receive rewards, but when we anticipate them. Unpredictable rewards create a state of constant anticipation, keeping dopamine levels elevated and driving continued behavior. This explains why people can become addicted to activities that provide only occasional positive outcomes. The power of intermittent reinforcement becomes most apparent in its most destructive applications. Gambling addictions are essentially intermittent reinforcement disorders, where unpredictable wins create psychological dependence despite overall losses. Slot machines are particularly effective because they provide frequent small rewards on variable schedules, keeping players in a state of perpetual anticipation. The near-miss effect, when symbols almost line up, actually increases motivation by suggesting that a win is imminent. Abusive relationships often maintain their hold through intermittent reinforcement patterns. Partners who alternate between cruelty and affection create powerful psychological bonds that are difficult to break. The unpredictability of kindness makes it more valuable and memorable than consistent affection would be. Victims become hypervigilant for signs of positive attention, and when it occurs, it provides intense relief that reinforces the relationship despite its overall toxicity. Social media platforms have masterfully exploited intermittent reinforcement through their notification systems. Likes, comments, shares, and messages arrive unpredictably, creating a variable reward schedule that keeps users constantly checking their devices. The uncertainty about when social validation will arrive makes it more psychologically compelling than predictable rewards would be. This explains why people compulsively check social media even when they consciously know it's not beneficial. The neuroscience of intermittent reinforcement reveals why it's so powerful. Brain imaging studies show that unpredictable rewards activate the same neural pathways as addictive drugs, creating changes in brain structure and function that persist long after the behavior stops. The uncertainty creates a state of arousal that can become psychologically necessary, making people feel anxious and empty when the intermittent rewards stop coming. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The rewards must be meaningful to the recipient. The schedule must be unpredictable, but not so rare as to cause extinction. And the behavior must be easy to repeat. Variable ratio schedules, where rewards come after unpredictable numbers of actions, are particularly effective because they create persistent uncertainty about when the next reward will arrive. The digital age has created new contexts for intermittent reinforcement through gaming and app design. Mobile games use variable reward schedules to keep players engaged, providing unpredictable bonuses, achievements, and progression markers. Dating apps exploit this principle by showing potential matches unpredictably, creating anticipation and compulsive checking behavior. Even email and text messaging operate on intermittent reinforcement principles, with unpredictable message arrival times creating checking compulsions. The paradox of intermittent reinforcement is that it can create stronger behavioral patterns than consistent reinforcement, even when the average reward rate is lower. This counterintuitive finding has profound implications for understanding human motivation, addiction, and behavior change. It suggests that consistency isn't always the best strategy for maintaining long-term behavior. Sometimes strategic inconsistency is more effective. Understanding intermittent reinforcement provides insights into both motivation and resistance. Recognizing when our behavior is being shaped by unpredictable rewards can help us make more conscious choices about how we spend our time and attention. We can also use this principle ethically to maintain beneficial behaviors, understanding that occasional rewards can be more motivating than constant ones. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human hope and persistence. Our tendency to continue behaviors that are occasionally rewarded reflects an evolutionary adaptation to uncertain environments where persistence in the face of occasional failure was necessary for survival. This same mechanism that helped our ancestors find food and mates in unpredictable environments can be hijacked by modern technologies and social systems. The ethical implications of intermittent reinforcement are significant. When used to maintain beneficial behaviors like exercise, learning, or creativity, variable reward schedules can support positive life changes. But when used to exploit psychological vulnerabilities for profit or control, they become tools for manipulation and harm. The intermittent reinforcement principle ultimately demonstrates that human behavior is shaped more by patterns of consequences than by absolute reward levels. We're not just motivated by what we get, but by when and how we get it. This creates opportunities for positive behavior change, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by systems designed to capture and hold our attention. The key to navigating intermittent reinforcement in our modern world is developing awareness of when our behavior is being shaped by unpredictable rewards and making conscious choices about which patterns we want to maintain. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can use them to support our authentic goals while protecting ourselves from exploitation by systems that profit from our psychological vulnerabilities. 13. False memory. Implantation. Imagine sitting in a therapy session, working through childhood memories with a well-meaning counselor. Through guided visualization and suggestion, you begin to recover vivid memories of events that never actually occurred. The memories feel completely real. You can see the faces, hear the voices, feel the emotions. But these memories are false, constructed from fragments of genuine experiences and external suggestions. This is the terrifying reality of false memory implantation, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how malleable and unreliable our most precious cognitive faculty, memory, truly is. False memory implantation exposes one of the most unsettling paradoxes of human consciousness. The very mechanism that preserves our past can be hijacked to create convincing experiences of events that never happened. Our memories, which feel like direct recordings of reality, are actually reconstructions that can be influenced by suggestion, expectation, and imagination. This discovery challenges our basic assumptions about the reliability of consciousness and raises profound questions about the nature of truth and identity. The psychological mechanisms underlying false memory creation are rooted in how our brains store and retrieve information. Memory isn't like a video recording that can be played back unchanged. It's more like a story that gets retold each time we remember it, with details potentially changing in each retelling. This reconstructive nature of memory makes it vulnerable to contamination from external sources, including leading questions, social pressure, and therapeutic suggestions. Elizabeth Loftus, the pioneer of false memory research, demonstrated these phenomena through hundreds of experiments involving over 20,000 participants. Her most famous study, known as the Lost in the Mall experiment, showed that 29% of participants developed false memories of being lost in a shopping mall as children when family members suggested it had happened. The participants didn't just claim to remember the event. They developed rich, detailed memories complete with emotional content and sensory details. The process of false memory implantation typically involves several stages. First, suggestion plants the seed of a false event. Then, imagination and visualization exercises help flesh out details. Social pressure and authority figures, like therapists or family members, provide validation for the emerging memories. Finally, the false memories become integrated into the person's autobiographical narrative, feeling as real as genuine memories. The power of false memory implantation becomes most apparent in its most consequential applications. The recovered memory movement of the 1980s and 1990s led to thousands of accusations of childhood sexual abuse based on memories recovered through suggestive therapeutic techniques. Many of these cases were later proven to be based on false memories, destroying families and lives in the process. The legal system had to grapple with the disturbing reality that eyewitness testimony, long considered the gold standard of evidence, could be systematically distorted. The neuroscience of false memories reveals why they feel so real. Brain imaging studies show that false memories activate the same neural networks as true memories, making them subjectively indistinguishable. When people recall false memories, their brains show patterns of activation consistent with genuine recollection, including emotional responses and sensory details. This suggests that false memories aren't just cognitive errors. They're neurologically real experiences that happen to be based on events that never occurred. The technique's effectiveness depends on several factors. The suggested event must be plausible within the person's life context. The suggestion must come from a trusted source, and the person must be encouraged to visualize and elaborate on the suggested event. Repeated exposure to suggestions increases the likelihood of false memory formation, as does the use of imagery and emotional processing techniques. The digital age has created new contexts for false memory implantation through social media and digital manipulation. Doctored photographs can create false memories of events that never happened. Social media posts can implant false memories of shared experiences. Even exposure to others' false memories online can lead to their adoption as personal memories through a process called social contagion. The implications of false memory research extend far beyond individual psychology. Legal systems have had to develop new procedures for handling eyewitness testimony, particularly in cases involving children or recovered memories. Therapeutic practices have been fundamentally altered, with many forms of memory recovery therapy now considered unethical. The research has also raised questions about the reliability of historical testimony and the nature of truth itself. The paradox of false memory implantation is that it reveals both the flexibility and fragility of human consciousness. Our ability to construct and reconstruct memories reflects sophisticated cognitive processes that allow us to learn from experience and adapt to new situations. But these same processes can be hijacked to create false realities that feel completely authentic. Understanding false memory implantation provides crucial insights into the nature of memory and identity. It reminds us that our memories are not infallible records of the past, but reconstructed narratives that can be influenced by present circumstances. This understanding can help us approach our own memories with appropriate humility and skepticism, particularly when they concern emotionally charged events. The research also highlights the importance of critical thinking in evaluating claims about the past. Whether in therapeutic settings, legal proceedings, or personal relationships, we need to be aware of how suggestion and social pressure can contaminate memory. This doesn't mean we should doubt all memories, but we should be aware of the factors that can influence their accuracy. The ethical implications of false memory research are profound. While the research has provided valuable insights into memory and consciousness, it has also been used to question the validity of genuine trauma memories. The challenge is to maintain appropriate skepticism about memory while still supporting trauma survivors and taking their experiences seriously. The study of false memory implantation ultimately reveals that human consciousness is more fluid and malleable than we typically assume. Our sense of self, built on memories of our past experiences, can be influenced by external suggestions and social pressures. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for positive therapeutic intervention. The key to navigating false memory phenomena is developing what researchers call memory literacy, understanding how memory works, what factors can influence its accuracy, and how to evaluate memory claims critically. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves from false memory implantation while still honoring the genuine experiences that shape our lives. 14. The testing effect. Imagine two students preparing for an important exam. Student A reads through the material repeatedly, highlighting key passages and taking detailed notes. Student B reads the material once, then spends time trying to recall the information from memory, struggling to remember details without looking at the text. Which student will perform better on the exam? If you guessed student A, you'd be wrong. Student B, who appeared to be struggling and making mistakes, will likely outperform the diligent rereader. This counterintuitive phenomenon is called the testing effect, and it reveals a fundamental paradox about how our brains learn and remember. The testing effect exposes a profound contradiction in how we think about learning. The activities that feel most effective in the moment, like rereading and highlighting, are often less beneficial than activities that feel difficult and frustrating, like trying to recall information from memory. This phenomenon challenges our intuitive understanding of learning and reveals how our brains are optimized for challenge rather than comfort. The psychological mechanisms underlying the testing effect are rooted in how our brains encode and strengthen memories. When we simply reread information, we create what psychologists call fluency illusions. The material feels familiar and easy to understand, leading us to believe we've learned it well. But this fluency doesn't translate to long-term retention. In contrast, when we struggle to retrieve information from memory, we engage in what researchers call desirable difficulties, cognitive challenges that feel unpleasant but actually strengthen learning. Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpik's landmark 2006 study provided compelling evidence for the testing effect. Students who read passages and then took tests on the material significantly outperformed those who spent the same time rereading the passages. The testing group showed superior retention after both short delays, 5 minutes, and long delays, 1 week, with the advantage becoming more pronounced over time. The act of retrieval, even when it involved errors and struggles, created stronger and more durable memories than passive review. The power of the testing effect lies in its ability to strengthen the neural pathways involved in memory retrieval. When we try to recall information, our brains engage in a process called retrieval practice that not only accesses existing memories, but also strengthens the connections that allow us to access them in the future. This is fundamentally different from simply recognizing information during rereading, which activates different neural networks and provides less lasting benefit. The technique works through several complementary mechanisms. First, retrieval practice strengthens the memory traces themselves, making them more resistant to forgetting. Second, the effort involved in retrieval creates multiple retrieval pathways, increasing the likelihood that information can be accessed under different conditions. Third, the struggle to remember identifies gaps in knowledge, directing attention to areas that need further study. The testing effect operates across different types of learning and memory. Medical students who test themselves on diagnostic procedures show better clinical performance than those who repeatedly study case materials. Language learners who practice recalling vocabulary words outperform those who repeatedly review word lists. Even motor skills benefit from testing. Athletes who practice skills under testing conditions show better performance than those who practice without evaluation. The phenomenon becomes even more powerful when testing involves errors and corrections. When students make mistakes during retrieval practice and then receive corrective feedback, they learn more effectively than when they study error-free materials. This suggests that the struggle and failure involved in testing create learning opportunities that smooth, comfortable study sessions cannot provide. The digital age has created new opportunities for implementing the testing effect through educational technology. Spaced repetition software uses algorithms to present information for testing at optimal intervals, maximizing the benefits of retrieval practice. Online learning platforms incorporate frequent quizzing and self-testing features that leverage the testing effect. Even simple flashcard apps provide more effective learning than passive reading because they require active recall. The neuroscience of the testing effect reveals fascinating insights about learning and memory. EEG studies show that successful retrieval practice activates brain networks associated with executive control and working memory, creating more robust and flexible memory representations. The struggle involved in retrieval appears to trigger neuroplastic changes that strengthen memory networks. The paradox of the testing effect is that it makes learning feel more difficult while making it more effective. Students often prefer rereading and highlighting because these activities feel productive and create immediate improvements in comprehension. But these feelings of progress are largely illusory. The real learning happens during the struggle to retrieve information from memory. Understanding the testing effect has profound implications for education and training. It suggests that effective learning requires strategic difficulty rather than smooth progress. Teachers and trainers need to design experiences that challenge learners to retrieve information actively rather than simply recognize it passively. This might involve frequent quizzing, practice problems, or other forms of retrieval practice. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of expertise and skill development. Experts in any field have typically engaged in extensive retrieval practice, constantly testing their knowledge and skills under challenging conditions. This process of deliberate practice, which involves constant testing and error correction, appears to be essential for developing high-level expertise. The ethical implications of the testing effect are generally positive, as it provides evidence-based strategies for improving learning and performance. However, it also highlights the importance of designing educational systems that prioritize long-term learning over short-term performance, as the benefits of testing become more apparent over time. The testing effect ultimately demonstrates that effective learning requires active engagement with information rather than passive consumption. Our brains are designed to learn through challenge and struggle, not through comfortable repetition. This creates opportunities for more effective education and training, but also requires us to embrace discomfort as a necessary part of the learning process. The key to leveraging the testing effect is understanding that difficulty and struggle are not obstacles to learning, they are learning. By designing educational experiences that incorporate frequent testing and retrieval practice, we can create more effective and durable learning outcomes. This requires a fundamental shift in how we think about education, from providing information to challenging learners, to actively construct and retrieve knowledge. 15. The Stroop effect. Imagine looking at the word red printed in blue ink and being asked to name the color of the text. This seemingly simple task becomes surprisingly difficult. Your brain wants to read the word red while you're trying to say blue. This cognitive conflict, known as the Stroop effect, reveals a fundamental paradox about human information processing. Our highly efficient automatic systems can actually interfere with our conscious intentions, creating mental conflicts that slow down our thinking and reveal the complex architecture of consciousness. The Stroop effect exposes the hidden complexity of tasks that appear simple on the surface. When we see a word, our brains automatically read it. This process is so well learned that we cannot easily turn it off. When we see a color, our brains automatically process the visual information. But when these two automatic processes provide conflicting information, our cognitive system experiences interference that reveals the underlying mechanisms of attention and control. The psychological mechanisms underlying the Stroop effect are rooted in what cognitive scientists call automaticity, the ability to perform cognitive tasks without conscious attention or effort. Reading is one of the most automatic processes in literate adults, happening so quickly and effortlessly that we cannot easily suppress it. Color naming, while also automatic, typically requires more conscious attention. When these processes conflict, the more automatic process, reading, tends to interfere with the less automatic one, color naming. John Ridley Stroop's original 1935 experiments provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. Participants took significantly longer to name the colors of words when the word meaning and color were incongruent, like red, printed in blue, compared to when they were congruent, or when naming colors of neutral stimuli. This difference in reaction time, now known as the Stroop effect, has been replicated thousands of times and has become one of the most studied phenomena in cognitive psychology. The power of the Stroop effect lies in its ability to reveal the automatic nature of reading and the limited capacity of our cognitive control systems. When we try to ignore the word meaning and focus only on the color, we must use executive control processes to suppress the automatic reading response. This cognitive effort creates measurable delays and errors, demonstrating that conscious control requires mental resources and is not always successful. The technique works through what psychologists call response conflict, when different cognitive processes generate competing responses to the same stimulus. Our brains must resolve this conflict by selecting one response while suppressing others. This process involves areas of the brain associated with executive control, including the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal cortex, which monitor for conflicts and implement control strategies. The Stroop effect has been adapted to study various aspects of cognitive processing beyond basic color-word interference. Emotional Stroop tasks use emotionally charged words to study attention bias in depression and anxiety. Addiction researchers use drug-related words to study attentional bias in substance abuse. The effect has also been used to study aging, brain damage, and developmental differences in cognitive control. The digital age has created new contexts for Stroop, like interference through information overload and multitasking. When we try to focus on one task while being bombarded with notifications and distractions, we experience conflicts similar to the original Stroop effect. The automatic processing of incoming information interferes with our conscious attempts to maintain focus, creating modern forms of cognitive interference. The neuroscience of the Stroop effect reveals fascinating insights about brain function and cognitive control. Neuroimaging studies show that Stroop interference activates networks associated with conflict monitoring and cognitive control, including the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These areas work together to detect conflicts and implement control strategies to resolve them. The phenomenon becomes even more interesting when we consider individual differences in Stroop performance. People with better executive control show smaller Stroop effects, suggesting that cognitive control abilities can be measured and potentially improved. Age-related changes in Stroop performance provide insights into how cognitive control changes across the lifespan, with older adults typically showing larger interference effects. The Stroop effect also reveals important insights about the nature of attention and consciousness. It demonstrates that we cannot simply decide to ignore irrelevant information. Our brains automatically process stimuli even when we're trying to focus on something else. This has implications for understanding attention disorders, meditation practice, and the challenges of maintaining focus in distracting environments. The paradox of the Stroop effect is that it reveals both the power and limitations of automatic processing. The fact that we can read words automatically without conscious effort is a remarkable cognitive achievement that allows us to process information rapidly and efficiently. But this same automaticity can create interference when we need to focus on other aspects of stimuli, demonstrating the costs of cognitive efficiency. Understanding the Stroop effect provides insights into the nature of cognitive control and attention. It shows that conscious control requires effort and resources, and that automatic processes can compete with conscious intentions. This understanding has practical implications for education, therapy, and performance optimization in situations requiring sustained attention. The technique also highlights the importance of practice and training in developing cognitive control. Just as reading becomes automatic through extensive practice, cognitive control abilities can be strengthened through training and experience. This suggests that attention and focus are skills that can be developed rather than fixed capacities. The Stroop effect ultimately demonstrates that human cognition involves complex interactions between automatic and controlled processes. Our brains are constantly processing information at multiple levels, and conflicts between these processes can reveal the underlying architecture of consciousness. By understanding these mechanisms, we can better appreciate both the remarkable efficiency of automatic processing and the challenges of maintaining conscious control in complex environments. The key to navigating Stroop-like interference in daily life is developing awareness of when automatic processes might conflict with conscious intentions and implementing strategies to manage these conflicts. This might involve reducing distractions, practicing mindfulness, or using environmental design to support focused attention. By understanding how automatic and controlled processes interact, we can make more conscious choices about how to direct our cognitive resources. 16. Loss aversion. Imagine you're offered two choices: receive $100 guaranteed, or flip a coin where heads gives you $200 and tails gives you nothing. Most people would choose the guaranteed $100, even though the coin flip has the same expected value. Now imagine a different scenario. You must either lose $100 guaranteed, or flip a coin where heads means you lose $200 and tails means you lose nothing. Suddenly, most people become risk seekers, choosing the risky option to avoid the certain loss. This asymmetry reveals one of the most fundamental biases in human decision-making: loss aversion, the principle that losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Loss aversion exposes a profound paradox in human psychology. We are not rational evaluators of objective outcomes, but emotional beings whose decisions are shaped by how options are framed relative to our current situation. The pain of losing $100 feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining $100, creating systematic biases in how we evaluate risks, make decisions, and respond to change. This discovery fundamentally challenged economic theories based on rational utility maximization and revealed the emotional foundations of human choice. The psychological mechanisms underlying loss aversion are rooted in how our brains process potential outcomes relative to reference points rather than in absolute terms. When we evaluate options, we don't consider their absolute value, but how they compare to our current situation or expectations. This reference dependence means that the same outcome can feel like a gain or loss depending on the starting point, creating predictable patterns of risk-seeking and risk-averse behavior. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's groundbreaking research in the 1970s provided the first systematic evidence of loss aversion through their development of prospect theory. Their experiments revealed that people's choices systematically violated the predictions of rational choice theory, showing instead that decisions are influenced by how options are framed and whether they appear as gains or losses. This work ultimately earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. The power of loss. Aversion lies in its ability to create asymmetric emotional responses to equivalent objective outcomes. When we face potential losses, our brains activate threat detection systems that create intense emotional responses designed to motivate protective action. When we face potential gains, our brains activate reward systems that create positive emotions, but these responses are typically less intense than the negative emotions associated with equivalent losses. The technique works through what psychologists call reference point dependence, our tendency to evaluate outcomes relative to a specific reference point rather than in absolute terms. This reference point can be our current situation, our expectations, or a comparison standard suggested by how choices are presented. Changes in reference points can completely alter our preferences, making the same objective outcome feel like a gain or loss. Loss aversion manifests across countless domains of human behavior. Investors hold losing stocks too long while selling winning stocks too quickly, a phenomenon known as the disposition effect. Employees resist salary cuts more strongly than they welcome equivalent salary increases. Consumers are more motivated by messages about avoiding losses, don't lose out, than by messages about achieving gains, get this benefit. Even small children show loss aversion when giving up toys they've been playing with. The stock market provides dramatic examples of loss aversion in action. During market downturns, investors often make irrational decisions driven by the pain of realized losses, selling stocks at the bottom of the market cycle. The 2008 financial crisis saw massive selling as investors tried to avoid further losses, often locking in losses that might have been temporary. This behavior contradicts rational investment strategies, but reflects the emotional reality of loss aversion. The digital age has created new contexts for loss aversion through design features that exploit this bias. Free trials make cancellation feel like a loss rather than a decision not to purchase. Limited time offers create artificial reference points that make letting deals expire feel like losses. Social media platforms use streaks and progress indicators that make stopping usage feel like losing accumulated benefits. The neuroscience of loss aversion reveals why losses feel more intense than equivalent gains. Brain imaging studies show that losses activate the amygdala and other structures associated with threat detection and negative emotion more strongly than gains activate reward centers. This suggests that loss aversion isn't just a cognitive bias, it's a fundamental feature of how our brains process potential outcomes. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how the endowment effect interacts with other psychological biases. It combines with loss aversion to make divestment feel particularly painful, with status quo bias to maintain existing ownership patterns, and with sunk cost fallacy to justify continued ownership of items that no longer serve us. These interactions create powerful psychological forces that can trap us in suboptimal ownership patterns. The paradox of the endowment effect is that it often leads to behaviors that reduce overall welfare and efficiency. By overvaluing things we own, we may miss opportunities for beneficial trades and exchanges. By becoming attached to possessions that no longer serve us, we may accumulate clutter and waste resources. By inflating the value of our own contributions and possessions, we may create barriers to cooperation and negotiation. Understanding the endowment effect provides insights into both personal decision-making and market dynamics. Recognizing when our attachment to possessions is driven by ownership bias rather than genuine utility can help us make more rational decisions about what to keep and what to let go. We can also use this knowledge to negotiate more effectively, understanding how ownership affects others' valuations. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human attachment and identity. Our possessions become extensions of ourselves, incorporated into our sense of identity in ways that make divestment feel like personal loss. This suggests that the endowment effect isn't just about economic valuation, it's about psychological ownership and self-concept. The ethical implications of the endowment effect are nuanced. While it can lead to inefficient resource allocation and barrier to beneficial exchanges, it also reflects genuine psychological needs for security and identity. The key is finding balance between acknowledging the psychological reality of ownership attachment while not letting it prevent beneficial changes and adaptations. The endowment effect ultimately demonstrates that human value perception is subjective and contextual rather than objective and universal. Our sense of what things are worth depends not just on their inherent properties, but on our relationship to them. This creates both opportunities for satisfaction and fulfillment through meaningful ownership and traps that can prevent us from adapting to changing circumstances. The key to navigating the endowment effect is developing awareness of how ownership influences our valuations and implementing strategies to evaluate possessions more objectively. This might involve considering opportunity costs, seeking outside perspectives, or regularly reassessing whether our possessions still serve our current goals and values. By understanding how ownership affects our thinking, we can make more conscious choices about what to acquire, keep, and release. 17. The endowment effect. Imagine you're given a coffee mug as a gift. Within minutes of receiving it, you begin to value that mug more highly than you would have if you were considering purchasing an identical mug in a store. This isn't about developing an emotional attachment. It's about how the mere fact of ownership changes your perception of value. Welcome to the endowment effect, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how possession itself alters our evaluation of objects, making us reluctant to part with things we own even when doing so would be economically rational. The endowment effect exposes a fundamental contradiction in how we think about value and ownership. Economic theory assumes that the value of an object should be independent of who owns it. A coffee mug should have the same value whether you own it or you're considering buying it. But human psychology operates by different rules. Once we own something, we begin to overvalue it, creating a gap between what we'd pay to acquire an item and what we'd accept to give it up. The psychological mechanisms underlying the endowment effect are rooted in loss aversion and our tendency to form rapid emotional attachments to objects in our possession. When we own something, selling it feels like a loss, while not owning it feels like a neutral state. This asymmetry means that the pain of giving up something we own is greater than the pleasure of acquiring the same thing, creating systematic biases in how we value possessions. Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler's groundbreaking 1990 experiments provided clear evidence of the endowment effect. In their famous mug experiments, participants were randomly given coffee mugs and then offered the opportunity to trade them for chocolate bars. Only about 10% chose to trade, despite the fact that in control groups, people were roughly equally divided in their preferences between mugs and chocolate bars. The mere act of ownership had created a preference for the owned item. The power of the endowment effect lies in its ability to create value through possession, rather than inherent utility. When people own an object, they begin to focus on its positive features and develop what psychologists call attachment bias, a tendency to overweight the benefits of owned items while underweighting their costs. This attachment forms quickly and can persist even when the original reasons for ownership disappear. The technique works through multiple psychological channels. First, ownership creates a sense of psychological possession that makes giving up the item feel like a personal loss. Second, the effort invested in acquiring and maintaining possessions creates what researchers call investment bias, the tendency to value things more highly when we've invested effort in them. Third, ownership changes our reference point, making the owned state feel normal and the non-owned state feel like a loss. The endowment effect manifests across numerous domains of human behavior. Homeowners consistently overvalue their properties compared to market assessments, leading to houses sitting unsold for months. Investors hold on to losing stocks longer than winning ones because selling feels like realizing a loss. Even digital goods show endowment effects. People become attached to virtual items in games and social media accounts in ways that exceed their objective utility. The real estate market provides particularly clear examples of the endowment effect in action. Homeowners often list their properties at prices significantly above market value, then gradually reduce prices over time as they slowly adjust to market realities. This isn't just optimistic pricing, it's a systematic bias where ownership creates inflated value perceptions that persist even in the face of contradictory market feedback. The digital age has created new contexts for the endowment effect. Through virtual ownership and digital goods, people develop attachments to social media profiles, online game characters, and digital collections that can rival their attachments to physical possessions. The psychology of ownership extends to intangible items, suggesting that the endowment effect is about psychological possession rather than just physical ownership. The neuroscience of the endowment effect reveals fascinating insights about how ownership affects brain function. When people view objects they own, brain areas associated with self-processing and reward become active, suggesting that owned objects become incorporated into our sense of self. This neural incorporation helps explain why giving up possessions can feel like losing parts of ourselves. 18. Mental accounting. Imagine you receive a $100 tax refund and immediately spend it on a luxury dinner, despite having significant credit card debt. Meanwhile, you diligently save money from your regular salary, even though mathematically, it makes more sense to pay off high-interest debt first. This seemingly irrational behavior reveals the power of mental accounting, a psychological phenomenon that shows how we create arbitrary categories for money that violate basic economic principles but reflect deeper truths about human psychology. Mental accounting exposes a fundamental paradox in how we think about money. Despite the fact that money is perfectly fungible, a dollar is a dollar, regardless of its source. We mentally categorize money into different accounts and treat these categories as if they were separate resources. This categorization leads to systematic biases in financial decision-making that can be both costly and beneficial, depending on the context. The psychological mechanisms underlying mental accounting are rooted in our need to organize and simplify complex financial information. Our brains cannot easily process all financial decisions as part of one integrated system, so we create mental shortcuts by categorizing money into different accounts: regular income, windfall gains, savings, entertainment budgets, and emergency funds. Each category comes with its own rules and emotional associations. Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 for his work on behavioral economics, identified mental accounting as a key feature of human financial behavior. His research revealed that people make different decisions about money depending on which mental account it comes from, even when the economic consequences are identical. A dollar from a tax refund feels different from a dollar from regular wages, leading to different spending patterns. The power of mental accounting lies in its ability to create spending and saving behaviors that wouldn't occur if we treated all money as equivalent. Tax refunds and bonuses often get spent on luxuries that people wouldn't buy with regular income, even though these are just different forms of the same resource. Similarly, people may keep money in low-interest savings accounts while carrying high-interest debt, because the savings account and debt account feel like separate financial domains. The technique works through what psychologists call psychological framing. The way we categorize and label financial resources affects how we think about using them. Money labeled as entertainment budget feels appropriate to spend on fun activities, while money labeled as emergency fund feels wrong to spend on anything but genuine emergencies. These labels create emotional associations that guide spending decisions. Mental accounting manifests across numerous financial behaviors. The house money effect leads gamblers to take bigger risks with winnings than with their original stake. The sunk cost fallacy causes people to continue investing in failing projects because they've already put money into the project account. Retirement savings often remain untouched even when people have high interest debt because these feel like separate financial categories. The phenomenon becomes particularly apparent in how people handle windfalls versus regular income. Lottery winners often spend their winnings on luxuries they would never buy with regular income, even though the money has the same economic value. Similarly, people treat gift cards differently from cash, often spending gift cards on items they wouldn't purchase with equivalent cash amounts. The digital age has created new contexts for mental accounting through various payment systems and financial apps. Credit cards create spending accounts that feel different from cash, leading to increased spending. Digital wallets and payment apps create new mental categories for money. Budgeting apps often exploit mental accounting by creating explicit categories that help people manage their finances through psychological compartmentalization. The neuroscience of mental accounting reveals fascinating insights about how our brains process financial information. Different types of financial decisions activate different neural networks, suggesting that mental accounting isn't just a cognitive strategy, but reflects genuine differences in how our brains process various financial resources. The emotional associations with different money categories create distinct patterns of brain activation. The paradox of mental accounting is that it can be both helpful and harmful to financial well-being. On one hand, it can lead to suboptimal decisions like keeping low-interest savings while carrying high-interest debt. On the other hand, it can support beneficial behaviors like retirement savings and emergency funds that people might not maintain if they treated all money as equivalent. The positive aspects of mental accounting include its ability to support long-term financial goals through psychological compartmentalization. By treating retirement savings as a separate account that shouldn't be touched, people can maintain savings even when they face short-term financial pressures. Similarly, emergency funds provide psychological security that might not exist if people viewed all money as available for immediate use. Understanding mental accounting provides insights into both financial decision-making and behavior change. Recognizing when our financial choices are driven by arbitrary mental categories rather than economic logic can help us make more rational decisions. We can also use mental accounting strategically to support beneficial financial behaviors through conscious categorization. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human financial psychology. Money isn't just an economic resource, it's a psychological resource that carries emotional meaning and social significance. Our financial behaviors reflect not just rational optimization, but also psychological needs for security, identity, and social connection. The ethical implications of mental accounting are significant. Financial services companies often exploit these psychological tendencies through product design and marketing that takes advantage of how people categorize money. Understanding these influences can help consumers make more conscious financial decisions. Mental accounting ultimately demonstrates that human financial behavior is fundamentally psychological rather than purely economic. Our financial decisions are shaped by how we categorize and think about money, not just by mathematical optimization. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for better financial management through psychological insight. The key to navigating mental accounting is developing awareness of how our mental categories affect our financial decisions and implementing strategies to evaluate financial choices more holistically. This might involve regularly reviewing our overall financial situation, considering opportunity costs across all accounts, or using mental accounting strategically to support beneficial behaviors while avoiding its pitfalls. 19. Gaslighting. Imagine being in a relationship where your partner consistently denies things you know happened, tells you you're being too sensitive when you express concerns, and gradually convinces you that your memory, perception, and judgment are unreliable. Over time, you begin to question your own sanity, becoming dependent on their version of reality. This is gaslighting, a a form of psychological manipulation so insidious that it can make victims doubt their own mental faculties and lived experiences. Gaslighting reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of human psychological vulnerability. Our sense of reality, which feels rock solid and independent, can be systematically undermined through persistent manipulation. The technique works by exploiting our fundamental need for coherent understanding of our experiences and our tendency to trust authority figures and intimate partners over our own perceptions when conflicts arise. The term gaslighting comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into believing she's going insane by secretly dimming the gas lights in their home while denying that the lights are changing. This fictional scenario perfectly captures the essence of gaslighting, creating contradictions between a victim's experience and the reality presented by the manipulator, then treating the victim's accurate perceptions as evidence of mental instability. The psychological mechanisms underlying gaslighting are rooted in how our brains construct coherent narratives from our experiences. When we encounter contradictions between our perceptions and external feedback, our brains experience cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state that demands resolution. Gaslighting exploits this by creating systematic contradictions that gradually erode the victim's confidence in their own perceptions. The technique operates through several distinct patterns that researchers have identified. First, denial and contradiction. The gaslighter consistently denies things that happened or presents alternative versions of events. Second, reality distortion. They reframe situations to make the victim appear unreasonable or unstable. Third, isolation. They separate the victim from other sources of reality validation. Fourth, credibility attacks. They undermine the victim's reputation and reliability to others. Gaslighting becomes particularly powerful when it occurs in relationships where there's an inherent power imbalance. Intimate partners, parents, employers, and authority figures are all positioned to exploit their influence to make victims doubt their own experiences. The closer the relationship, the more devastating the effects, as victims lose their primary sources of emotional support and reality validation. The process typically follows a predictable pattern. Initially, the gaslighter creates small contradictions that seem minor or ambiguous. The victim might notice discrepancies, but dismiss them as misunderstandings. Gradually, the contradictions become more frequent and significant. The victim begins to question their own memory and perception. Eventually, the victim becomes dependent on the gaslighter's version of reality, unable to trust their own judgment. The digital age has created new contexts for gaslighting through text messages, emails, and social media. Digital communications can be deleted, edited, or taken out of context, making it easier to create contradictions and deny previous statements. Social media platforms can be used to isolate victims from support networks and spread false narratives about their behavior or mental state. The neuroscience of gaslighting reveals how this manipulation affects brain function. Chronic stress from persistent reality contradiction can alter brain structure and function, particularly in areas associated with memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Victims often show symptoms similar to those seen in trauma and abuse survivors, including hypervigilance, anxiety, and depression. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how gaslighting interacts with other psychological vulnerabilities. People with low self-esteem, trauma histories, or strong needs for approval are particularly susceptible. The technique can also exploit cultural factors, using societal biases about gender, race, or mental health to make victims' experiences seem less credible. The damage from gaslighting extends far beyond the immediate relationship. Victims often struggle with long-term effects, including difficulty trusting their own judgment, chronic self-doubt, anxiety, depression, and problems forming healthy relationships. The systematic undermining of reality perception can create lasting psychological damage that requires significant time and often professional help to overcome. Understanding gaslighting provides crucial insights into recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation. Warning signs include persistent denial of your experiences, being told you're too sensitive, or overreacting, isolation from friends and family, and increasing self-doubt about your own perceptions. Recognition is the first step toward protection and recovery. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of psychological abuse and control. Gaslighting isn't just about winning arguments or getting one's way. It's about fundamentally altering another person's relationship with reality. This makes it one of the most damaging forms of psychological manipulation, as it attacks the very foundations of psychological functioning. The ethical implications of gaslighting are clear. It represents a serious form of psychological abuse that can cause lasting harm. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for mental health professionals, legal systems, and society as a whole. The technique also highlights the importance of maintaining diverse sources of reality validation and trusting our own experiences, even when others challenge them. Recovery from gaslighting typically involves rebuilding confidence in one's own perceptions, often with the help of trusted friends, family members, or mental health professionals. Keeping journals, maintaining outside relationships, and seeking professional support can all help victims reconnect with their own reality and rebuild psychological autonomy. Gaslighting ultimately demonstrates that our sense of reality, while feeling absolute and independent, is actually socially constructed and can be influenced by others. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for healing through supportive relationships that validate our experiences and help us reconstruct reliable reality perception. The key to protecting against gaslighting is maintaining diverse sources of reality validation, trusting our own experiences even when others challenge them, and seeking support when we notice patterns of reality contradiction in our relationships. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves and others from this devastating form of manipulation. 20. Love bombing. Imagine meeting someone who seems perfect. They shower you with attention, gifts, and declarations of love from the very first date. They tell you you're their soulmate, that they've never felt this way before, that you're the most amazing person they've ever met. The intensity is intoxicating, but also overwhelming. This isn't genuine love, it's love bombing, a manipulation technique that uses excessive affection and attention to create emotional dependency and control. Love bombing reveals a disturbing paradox about human relationships. The very behaviors that should indicate deep affection and commitment can be weaponized to create psychological dependence. What appears to be intense love is actually a calculated strategy to bypass normal relationship boundaries and create rapid emotional attachment that can later be exploited for control and manipulation. The psychological mechanisms underlying love bombing are rooted in how our brains respond to intense positive attention and validation. When we receive excessive affection, our brains release dopamine and oxytocin, neurochemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and attachment. Love bombers exploit this natural response by providing overwhelming amounts of positive attention that create neurochemical highs similar to those experienced with addictive substances. The technique operates through several distinct phases that researchers have identified. First, the idealization phase. The love bomber presents themselves as perfect while treating the target as extraordinarily special. Second, the overwhelm phase. They flood the target with attention, gifts, and declarations of love that exceed normal relationship progression. Third, the dependency phase. The target becomes emotionally dependent on the intense validation. Fourth, the devaluation phase. The love bomber begins to withdraw affection and introduce criticism or abuse. Love bombing becomes particularly effective because it exploits fundamental human needs for connection, validation, and belonging. The intense attention feels like finally being truly seen and appreciated, creating powerful emotional responses that can override rational evaluation of the relationship's health and sustainability. Victims often describe the experience as intoxicating and addictive, making it difficult to recognize the manipulation. The process typically follows predictable patterns. Love bombers often target people during vulnerable periods, after breakups, during life transitions, or when self-esteem is low. They quickly escalate emotional intimacy, professing love within days or weeks, making grand gestures that seem romantic, but are actually designed to create obligation and dependency. They often isolate their targets from friends and family, claiming these relationships are inferior to their special connection. The digital age has created new contexts for love bombing through social media and dating apps. Digital communication allows love bombers to maintain constant contact, sending streams of messages, photos, and declarations of affection that create the illusion of deep connection while bypassing normal relationship development. Social media provides platforms for public displays of affection that can seem romantic, but are actually designed to create social pressure and obligation. The neuroscience of love bombing reveals how this manipulation affects brain function. The intense positive attention activates reward pathways in ways that can create psychological dependence. When the love bomber later withdraws affection, the brain experiences withdrawal symptoms similar to those seen in addiction, creating desperate attempts to regain the original high through pleasing the manipulator. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how love bombing interacts with attachment styles and psychological vulnerabilities. People with insecure attachment styles, low self-esteem, or histories of emotional neglect are particularly susceptible. The technique can also exploit cultural factors, using societal narratives about romance and true love to make the manipulation seem normal or desirable. The damage from love bombing extends far beyond the immediate relationship. Victims often struggle with long-term effects, including difficulty trusting their own judgment about relationships, confusion about what healthy love looks like, trauma bonding that makes it difficult to leave harmful relationships, and increased vulnerability to future manipulation. The experience can fundamentally alter how people approach intimate relationships. Understanding love bombing provides crucial insights into recognizing and resisting emotional manipulation. Warning signs include excessive attention and gifts early in relationships, premature declarations of love, pressure to commit quickly, isolation from friends and family, and partners who seem too good to be true. The intensity that feels romantic is actually a red flag for potential manipulation. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of healthy versus unhealthy relationships. Genuine love develops gradually through mutual respect, shared experiences, and growing understanding. It includes space for individual identity and outside relationships. Love bombing, in contrast, is characterized by intensity, possession, and attempts to merge identities rapidly. The ethical implications of love bombing are clear. It represents a serious form of emotional manipulation that can cause lasting psychological harm. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for mental health professionals, educators, and anyone involved in helping others navigate relationships. The technique also highlights the importance of relationship education that teaches people to recognize healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns. Recovery from love bombing typically involves rebuilding trust in one's own judgment, learning to recognize healthy relationship patterns, and often seeking professional support to address trauma bonding and attachment issues. Setting boundaries, maintaining outside relationships, and taking time to develop relationships gradually can all help protect against future manipulation. Love bombing ultimately demonstrates that our deepest human needs for connection and validation can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The intensity that feels like love is actually a form of psychological assault designed to create dependency and control. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for healing through understanding healthy relationship dynamics. The key to protecting against love bombing is developing awareness of healthy relationship progression, trusting our instincts when something feels too intense too quickly, and maintaining connections with trusted friends and family who can provide outside perspectives on our relationships. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves and others from this devastating form of emotional manipulation. 21. The halo effect. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. They're tall, well-dressed, smiling with confidence. Before they even speak, you feel drawn to them, maybe even impressed. Without knowing their intelligence, kindness, or competence, your brain has already filled in the blanks. You assume they must be capable, trustworthy, even admirable. But here's the unsettling truth. You're not judging reality. You're trapped in one of psychology's most powerful illusions, the halo effect. The halo effect is the tendency for our overall impression of a person, often shaped by one striking quality, to influence how we judge their other traits. If someone appears attractive, we unconsciously assume they're also intelligent, friendly, or morally good. If someone radiates charm, we believe they must be competent. It's not logic guiding us, it's perception, bleeding from one domain into another, clouding judgment without us ever realizing it. This phenomenon was first coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920. He conducted experiments where commanding officers in the military were asked to rate their soldiers across various traits like physique, intelligence, leadership, and loyalty. The results were staggering. If an officer rated a soldier as tall and handsome, that soldier was also rated higher in intelligence, leadership, and character, even when no evidence supported those conclusions. A single positive trait created a radiant glow, like a halo, illuminating unrelated qualities. The inverse is equally true. Known as the horns effect, a single negative trait can cast a shadow across everything else. If someone appears sloppy or awkward, we may unconsciously assume they're lazy, unintelligent, or dishonest, regardless of the truth. In both directions, the halo effect distorts reality, showing us not who people are, but who our minds want them to be. Think about how this bias shapes everyday life. In education, teachers often rate attractive or well-behaved students as more intelligent. These students receive more attention, more encouragement, and better grades, not because of ability, but because of perception. In business, job candidates who look polished and confident are judged more competent, even if their skills are average. In politics, taller candidates are disproportionately favored in elections, a startling example of how physical presence outweighs policy in shaping votes. Marketing thrives on the halo effect. A brand that dazzles us with one product earns loyalty across its entire line. Apple didn't just sell iPhones, it sold sleekness, simplicity, genius. The glow of one device radiated across all products, creating a near-religious following. Celebrities embody the halo effect too. A beloved actor endorses a perfume, and suddenly, we believe it must smell divine. A famous athlete advertises shoes, and millions believe the shoes will unlock excellence. Their personal halo spills onto the product, shaping our choices without logic. But the most chilling aspect of the halo effect lies in how it infiltrates justice. Courtroom studies have revealed that attractive defendants receive lighter sentences than unattractive ones for the same crimes. Jurors unconsciously equate beauty with goodness, making punishment uneven and unfair. The simple fact of appearance bends the scale of justice, revealing just how fragile objectivity can be when perception intervenes. The paradox deepens when we realize the halo effect operates silently, beneath conscious awareness. Even when people are warned about it, they can't fully escape its influence. A 2010 study showed participants who were explicitly told not to let attractiveness influence their ratings of intelligence still gave higher scores to attractive individuals. Awareness doesn't break the spell. It only reveals how powerless we are to resist it. Consider how this bias shapes relationships. First impressions matter not because they reveal truth, but because they build halos. If someone's first act is kind, we assume they must be generous in all areas. If their first words are witty, we imagine intelligence across the board. This illusion can make early romance intoxicating, as a single spark of attraction colors the entire person in glowing light. But it also makes disappointment inevitable, as reality slowly pierces the halo, revealing the complex, imperfect individual beneath. The halo effect doesn't just distort how we see others, it shapes how we see ourselves. If people respond positively to one of our traits, we may internalize the illusion, believing we possess qualities we don't. Compliments on appearance may inflate confidence in unrelated skills. Success in one domain may convince us of superiority in others. This can inspire confidence, but it can also breed arrogance, as the glow of the halo blinds us to our limitations. History is filled with examples of the halo effect steering societies. Charismatic leaders, admired for presence or oratory, have been elevated to positions of power beyond their competence. Their halos of charm or strength masked flaws, leading entire nations into disaster. Advertising moguls and propagandists alike understood this power. They knew that cultivating one shining image could hide corruption, cruelty, or incompetence behind the brilliance of a halo. The paradox of the halo effect is that it reveals both our social intelligence and our vulnerability. Our ancestors evolved to make quick judgments in uncertain environments. If someone looked strong, healthy, or confident, it often correlated with survival advantages. Trusting those signals was adaptive. But in modern life, where appearances can be manufactured and curated, the same mental shortcut exposes us to manipulation. What once kept us safe now makes us susceptible. The neuroscience behind the halo effect offers further insight. Brain imaging studies show that when people evaluate attractive individuals, regions of the brain associated with reward and pleasure light up. These emotional activations spill over into unrelated judgments, biasing how we perceive intelligence, kindness, or trustworthiness. The brain doesn't separate traits neatly. Instead, emotion bleeds across domains, reshaping cognition itself. Yet there's another twist. The halo effect doesn't only elevate, it blinds. When someone has one shining trait, we may ignore red flags. A successful entrepreneur is assumed to be moral, even when evidence suggests otherwise. A skilled artist is idolized despite harmful behavior. Celebrities are shielded by halos that protect them from scrutiny, until scandals break the illusion and the horns effect crashes down. Perhaps the most dangerous halos are those built in our personal lives. Parents may unconsciously favor one child over another based on appearance, charm, or resemblance. Friends may overlook betrayals because early kindness painted a halo too bright to fade. Partners may endure toxic relationships because initial attraction colored judgment too strongly. In each case, the halo clouds reality, and clarity only arrives when the light dims. But here lies the paradoxical opportunity. If the halo effect can distort truth, it can also be harnessed for good. Teachers aware of the bias can deliberately cultivate halos of encouragement, allowing students to believe in themselves more deeply. Leaders can leverage their positive traits to inspire others toward collective goals, provided they balance charisma with humility. Even in our own lives, we can use the glow of one's strength to boost confidence in areas where we feel uncertain. The danger lies in forgetting that the halo is not the whole. To resist the halo effect, we must practice conscious evaluation, breaking impressions into separate domains. Ask yourself, is this person actually skilled, or does their confidence merely suggest competence? Is this product truly good, or am I dazzled by branding? Is this leader wise, or simply charismatic? By forcing traits into isolation, we begin to dismantle the illusion. Awareness also helps in designing fairer systems. Structured interviews in hiring reduce the influence of appearance and charisma by standardizing questions. Blind auditions in orchestras, where candidates perform behind a screen, dramatically increase the selection of women, showing how removing halos reveals true talent. In courts, emphasizing evidence over appearance can counterbalance unconscious biases, though the challenge remains immense. At its core, the halo effect forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about free will and fairness. If our judgments are so easily swayed by irrelevant qualities, how rational are our decisions? How much of what we believe about others is projection rather than perception? Are we truly seeing people, or only the light cast by their halos? The answer may lie not in eliminating the halo effect, an impossible task, but in learning to see around it. True wisdom comes from recognizing our mental shortcuts and compensating for them. It means remembering that beauty doesn't guarantee kindness, that confidence doesn't ensure competence, that charisma doesn't equal morality. It means slowing down, questioning assumptions, and searching for evidence beyond first impressions. The halo effect is both a mirror and a mask. It reveals how deeply human we are, creatures drawn to light, eager to believe the best, desperate for patterns that make the world simple. But it also hides reality, distorting truth behind glow or shadow. To see clearly, we must learn to separate the person from the projection, the reality from the radiance. Only then can we navigate a world where halos are everywhere, shaping our choices, clouding our vision, and reminding us that the greatest illusions are not out there, but within our own minds. 22. The Pygmalion effect. Picture a classroom filled with students, some wide-eyed and eager, others shy and uncertain. The teacher stands at the front, holding a list of names. Unknown to the students, some names on that list have been marked as gifted, chosen at random, not because of actual test scores or hidden talents, but because researchers whispered to the teacher that these children were destined to shine. Months later, those very students are outperforming their peers, scoring higher, participating more, showing greater confidence. The mystery is not in their abilities, but in the expectations placed upon them. This is the essence of the Pygmalion effect, the psychological phenomenon where belief becomes reality, where expectations have the power to transform performance. The story of the Pygmalion effect begins with a groundbreaking experiment in 1968 conducted by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. In their study, teachers were told that certain students, identified by a special test, were poised for intellectual spurts in the coming year. In truth, the test was fictitious and the students were chosen at random. Yet by the end of the school year, those randomly selected children had indeed shown greater academic improvement compared to their peers. The only real difference was the teachers' expectations. The belief that those students were gifted led teachers to give them more encouragement, more attention, and more challenging opportunities, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The term Pygmalion effect comes from the myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who fell in love with a statue he carved. His devotion and belief breathed life into the stone, transforming it into a living woman. The metaphor is powerful. Belief shaping reality, expectation carving behavior, attention turning potential into achievement. Just as Pygmalion's faith animated marble, so too can human expectation animate talent, effort, and growth. At its core, the Pygmalion effect demonstrates that our perceptions of others are not passive observations, but active forces that shape behavior. When teachers believe in a student's potential, they unconsciously act in ways that nurture growth. They offer more detailed feedback, ask deeper questions, show greater patience, and radiate warmth. These small differences accumulate, creating an environment where the student begins to believe in themselves. The expectation becomes contagious, spreading from teacher to student until it transforms into performance. But the phenomenon extends far beyond classrooms. In workplaces, managers who believe in their employees' abilities tend to assign them more responsibilities, provide mentorship, and trust them with important projects. Employees, sensing that trust, rise to the challenge, working harder and achieving more. Studies show that when leaders expect excellence, teams deliver excellence. When leaders doubt, performance suffers. The workplace becomes a mirror of belief. The Pygmalion effect also appears in sports. Coaches who see potential in certain athletes often give them more playtime, more training, and more encouragement. These athletes then improve at faster rates, not because they were inherently superior, but because belief created opportunities. The same effect can be seen in parenting. Children who grow up under the shadow of high yet supportive expectations often achieve more than those raised with indifference or doubt. The subtle signals of belief, smiles, encouragement, challenges offered, become the soil where potential takes root. Yet the paradox of the Pygmalion effect is that it works in both directions. Just as positive expectations can elevate, negative expectations can suppress. When teachers believe certain students lack ability, they unconsciously offer less attention, fewer challenges, and colder responses. These students sense the lowered expectations and internalize them, leading to poorer performance. This darker side is often called the Golem effect, named after the mythical creature bound by the limits imposed upon it. The power of belief can create excellence, but it can just as easily create failure. Consider how this unfolds in subtle daily interactions. A manager may expect less from certain employees based on stereotypes, assumptions, or first impressions. Without realizing it, they provide less support, less trust, and fewer opportunities for advancement. The employees, sensing the lack of faith, disengage and underperform, confirming the manager's original assumption. The cycle repeats, not because of inherent ability, but because expectation shaped reality. The implications are profound. It means that much of human potential is not fixed, but conditional. It blooms in the presence of belief and withers under doubt. Talent is not just a gift, it is a response to the environment of expectation. The Pygmalion effect challenges the notion of objectivity in performance, revealing that achievement is not simply the result of innate ability, but of the social context that nurture or stifle it. The neuroscience of expectation sheds light on this phenomenon. Brain imaging studies suggest that belief and encouragement activate motivational circuits, increasing dopamine release and improving focus, energy, and persistence. When someone believes in us, it doesn't just make us feel good, it literally alters our brain chemistry, making us more capable of sustained effort and performance. Expectation becomes biology, but the Pygmalion effect also raises unsettling ethical questions. If teachers, managers, or leaders unknowingly shape performance through expectations, how many lives have been silently sculpted by bias? How many students labeled as average never realized their potential because no one believed in them? How many workers stagnated because managers assumed they lacked promise? How many children grew into adults carrying the weight of low expectations placed upon them in their earliest years? The phenomenon also reveals the danger of inequality in society. Expectations are not distributed evenly. Biases of race, gender, and class often distort who receives belief and encouragement. A teacher may unconsciously expect more from one student than another. A manager may assume leadership potential in one candidate but not another, based not on merit but on stereotypes. These expectations shape outcomes, perpetuating inequality across generations. The Pygmalion effect, left unchecked, can become a silent engine of injustice. Yet there is hope in understanding it. Awareness provides the first step toward change. Teachers trained to recognize their biases can deliberately cultivate high expectations for all students, providing equal opportunities to thrive. Managers who consciously believe in every team member can create workplaces where hidden potential is uncovered. Parents who consistently communicate faith in their children can nurture resilience and ambition. The power of expectation, once recognized, can be harnessed intentionally. History offers countless examples of the Pygmalion effect at work. Consider Thomas Edison, labeled difficult by teachers but encouraged by his mother, who believed in his brilliance. Her expectation became the fuel that carried him through thousands of failed experiments to eventually revolutionize technology. Or think of leaders who transformed societies not by brute force, but by convincing people to believe in their own capacity for greatness. Expectation is the spark behind revolutions, inventions, and personal transformations alike. But the phenomenon also demands humility. If so much of success depends on belief, then no one achieves greatness entirely alone. Behind every breakthrough stands someone who believed. Behind every artist, athlete, or entrepreneur is a parent, mentor, or teacher who provided the expectation that lit the path. The Pygmalion effect reminds us that we are deeply interconnected, our fates woven together through the invisible threads of belief and perception. There is also a personal dimension to this phenomenon. We are not only influenced by the expectations of others, we are also sculpted by the expectations we place upon ourselves. Psychologists call this the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you are capable, you act with confidence, persevere through setbacks, and seek opportunities. If you believe you are destined to fail, your efforts falter and failure becomes reality. The Pygmalion effect teaches us that our internal expectations can be just as powerful as external ones. The danger, of course, is that self-doubt can become a self-fulfilling curse. People trapped in cycles of failure often internalize the belief that they are incapable, and every setback reinforces the prophecy. Breaking this cycle requires more than willpower. It requires creating new expectations, both internally and externally, that nurture growth. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of the Pygmalion effect. Belief is not just an opinion, it is an action. When we expect greatness from others, we behave differently toward them. When we expect greatness from ourselves, we act differently toward our own lives. Expectation is the seed of transformation, shaping not just how we see the world, but how the world becomes. The paradox is clear. We live in a world where reality is partly constructed by belief. Success is not only a reflection of ability, but of the expectations that surround it. The Pygmalion effect reminds us that we are sculptors, constantly shaping each other's lives with the subtle chisel of belief. The question is whether we are sculpting statues of marble that never breathe, or breathing life into potential that otherwise might remain unseen. So pause and reflect. Who has placed a halo of expectation upon you? Whose belief has shaped your path? And perhaps more importantly, upon whom are you placing your expectations now? For in those expectations lies the power to suppress or to unleash, to limit or to liberate, to hold someone back or to help them rise. The Pygmalion effect is more than a psychological curiosity. It is a reminder of the extraordinary responsibility we carry in every classroom, every workplace, every relationship. To expect greatness is to invite greatness. To expect failure is to manufacture it. The choice, whether we recognize it or not, belongs to us. 23. The spotlight effect. Imagine walking into a crowded room. Maybe it's a classroom, a meeting, or even just a cafe. You notice a stain on your shirt, a bad haircut, or maybe you tripped slightly as you came in. Your heart races, convinced that everyone saw, everyone noticed, everyone is silently judging. But here's the truth. Most people are too absorbed in themselves to care. The illusion that we are constantly under scrutiny is one of psychology's strangest tricks. This is the spotlight effect, the tendency to vastly overestimate how much others notice and remember about us. The spotlight effect was formally studied in the late 1990s by psychologists Thomas Gilovich, Victoria Medvec, and Kenneth Savitsky. In one famous experiment, students were asked to wear embarrassing t-shirts, some featuring the face of Barry Manilow, while walking into a room full of peers. The students were certain that half the room would notice the shirt. In reality, only about 20% of people even registered it. The wearers felt like a spotlight was glaring down on them, exposing their awkwardness, while most others were lost in their own concerns. This phenomenon reveals a deep paradox about human attention. We are the centers of our own worlds. Our experiences, our mistakes, our triumphs, all of it feels monumental because we live inside our own perspective. Yet we forget that everyone else is living inside their own spotlight, paying far less attention to us than we imagine. What feels like humiliation to us often goes unnoticed or forgotten moments later by others. The spotlight effect thrives on self-consciousness. When something feels important to us, we assume it must feel important to others. If we obsess over a bad haircut, we project that obsession outward, believing others are focused on it too. But in reality, most people are too busy worrying about their own appearance, their own insecurities, to spare more than a fleeting glance at ours. It is not cruelty, but simple self-absorption that blinds people to the details we find unbearable. The evolutionary roots of this bias are intriguing. Our ancestors lived in tight social groups where reputation meant survival. Being watched, judged, or excluded had real consequences. Our brains evolved to overdetect social attention, to assume eyes were always on us. Better to be paranoid and cautious than to risk social exile. In modern life, however, this hyper-awareness is misplaced. Most strangers in a coffee shop don't care about your mismatched socks, but your brain, primed by ancient fears of group judgment, whispers otherwise. The spotlight effect can be paralyzing. It keeps people from speaking up in meetings, dancing at parties, wearing bold clothing, or pursuing opportunities. We hold back, convinced that mistakes will be magnified under imaginary scrutiny. A stumble becomes a catastrophe in our minds. A failed joke feels unforgettable. Yet research shows that others are far less critical than we imagine. Even when people do notice our blunders, they rarely dwell on them. They move on quickly because they are preoccupied with their own spotlight moments. There's a darker twist. The spotlight effect doesn't just magnify embarrassment, it also inflates ego. Just as we believe others notice our flaws, we also believe they notice our achievements more than they actually do. A clever remark, a stylish outfit, a small success at work. We imagine these moments linger in others' minds. In truth, most are forgotten almost immediately. The spotlight distorts in both directions, making us believe we are more central to other people's stories than we truly are. Social media intensifies this illusion. Posting online feels like stepping onto a stage, with every like, comment, or silence magnified into significance. A photo we regret sharing, a typo in a caption, a video that doesn't perform. We imagine the world is watching, judging. Yet studies show that most people scroll mindlessly, barely noticing. What feels like a permanent mark of shame to us is often invisible to the fast-moving crowd. The spotlight effect, magnified by digital platforms, fuels anxiety and insecurity on a massive scale. But the paradox deepens when we flip the lens. If we overestimate how much people notice us, we also underestimate how forgiving and forgetful they are. Research shows that even when observers do notice our mistakes, they rarely judge as harshly as we imagine. People are kinder, more distracted, and less critical than the inner critic suggests. The spotlight shines brightest in our own imagination, not in reality. Consider how liberating this realization can be. If most people aren't watching as closely as we think, then we are freer than we believe. The stain on your shirt won't ruin your reputation. The awkward comment in a meeting won't define your career. The failed joke at a party won't echo in everyone's mind. People notice far less, remember even less, and care almost not at all. Recognizing this gives us permission to take risks, to live boldly, to let go of perfectionism. Yet the spotlight effect doesn't vanish with awareness. Like all cognitive biases, it resists rational correction. Even when we know intellectually that others aren't paying much attention, the visceral feeling of being watched persists. Our hearts still race, our cheeks still flush. It takes practice, conscious reframing, repeated exposure to weaken the illusion. Over time, we can learn to redirect the spotlight outward, to see the world not as a stage where we're being judged, but as a shared space where everyone is fumbling, distracted, and self-absorbed. The effect also reveals something profound about empathy. If everyone feels trapped in their own spotlight, then much of human anxiety is shared. The person you think is judging your flaws is probably worrying about their own. The student terrified of reading aloud, the professional dreading a presentation, the teenager anxious at a party, they are all suffering the same illusion. Recognizing this can soften judgment, creating compassion for ourselves and others. The neuroscience of the spotlight effect suggests it arises from overactivity in the brain's mentalizing networks, the regions that simulate what others are thinking about us. These circuits are vital for social life, but when they overfire, they create illusions of scrutiny. Our brains spin stories about how others see us, even when those stories are wildly inaccurate. In truth, the spotlight is not real. It is a trick of overactive social cognition. Practical strategies exist for breaking free. One is perspective taking, deliberately reminding yourself that others are too busy worrying about themselves to obsess over you. Another is exposure, deliberately doing small, embarrassing things, like wearing mismatched socks or singing badly in public, and noticing how little others actually care. Over time, this weakens the illusion. Mindfulness also helps. By grounding yourself in the present moment, you shift attention from imagined judgment to real experience. But perhaps the most powerful antidote is embracing vulnerability. When we accept that embarrassment is inevitable, that mistakes are part of being human, the spotlight loses its sting. Shame shrinks when we stop resisting it. Those who live boldly, who speak, sing, stumble, and still smile, show that freedom comes not from perfection, but from refusing to live under imaginary lights. The spotlight effect ultimately forces us to confront the limits of self-importance. We are not the center of other people's universes. We are side characters, fleeting impressions, background details in the lives of others. This truth can feel humbling, even disappointing, but it is also profoundly freeing. If no one is watching as closely as we think, then we are liberated to live more authentically, to take risks, to embrace imperfection without fear. So next time you feel the burn of imagined eyes on you, when your voice cracks, when your clothes don't fit right, when you make a mistake, remember this: the spotlight is an illusion. Most people didn't notice. Those who did will forget. And those who truly matter are too busy carrying their own spotlights to dwell on yours. The paradox of the spotlight effect is that the very illusion that traps us can also set us free. By realizing how little others are really watching, we discover a hidden permission to stumble, to fail, to try again, and to live without the constant fear of judgment. In a world full of imagined lights, perhaps the greatest courage is learning to walk as if the stage is empty, knowing the audience was never really there at all. 24. Learned helplessness. Imagine a dog placed in a cage with an electrified floor. Each time the shock comes, the animal tries desperately to escape. It scratches, jumps, and throws itself against the walls. But there is no way out. After repeated failures, something changes. The next time the shock arrives, the dog doesn't even try. It whimpers, lies down, and endures the pain. Later, when the barrier is removed and escape is possible, the dog still doesn't move. Freedom is within reach, but it has been conditioned not to believe in it. This tragic experiment is the foundation of what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where repeated exposure to uncontrollable stress convinces us that nothing we do matters, even when opportunities for change exist. The term learned helplessness was coined in the late 1960s by Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer. Their studies, though ethically troubling by today's standards, revealed something profound about the link between control, behavior, and mental health. The dogs exposed to uncontrollable shocks did not just fail to escape. They exhibited symptoms eerily similar to human depression: passivity, lethargy, withdrawal, and a sense of hopelessness. It wasn't the shocks themselves that broke them, but the perception of futility. When the world teaches you that your actions don't matter, you stop acting altogether. This insight reshaped psychology. For decades, depression had been explained primarily as a chemical imbalance or a matter of flawed personality. Learned helplessness offered a new lens. Perhaps despair arises not only from within, but from the way repeated failures and uncontrollable events shape our expectations about life. If we come to believe that effort makes no difference, we stop trying, and this passivity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The paradox of learned helplessness is that it turns real powerlessness into imagined permanence. At first, the individual truly has no control, whether it's an animal in a cage, a child in a dysfunctional family, or a worker trapped in an unfair system. But over time, that lack of control is generalized. Even when doors open, even when escape is possible, the person remains still. The prison walls are no longer physical, they are psychological. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. A student who repeatedly fails math tests despite studying hard may eventually give up, deciding, "I'm just not a math person." Even if tutoring, new methods, or second chances are available, the belief in helplessness prevents effort. A job seeker rejected dozens of times may stop applying altogether, convinced no employer will ever value them. Victims of abusive relationships often stay, not because they cannot leave, but because they have been conditioned to believe escape is futile. In each case, the learned belief in helplessness becomes more powerful than reality. The phenomenon also explains why some groups in society struggle generation after generation. Communities facing systemic poverty or discrimination may internalize the idea that upward mobility is impossible. The repeated experience of barriers and failures creates a collective sense of helplessness. Even when opportunities arise, participation is low, not from laziness, but from a conditioned belief that effort will not be rewarded. This makes learned helplessness not just a psychological issue, but a social one, deeply intertwined with inequality and injustice. Neuroscience has begun to uncover the mechanisms behind this effect. Research shows that uncontrollable stress alters brain function in regions like the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, areas responsible for decision-making, motivation, and emotional regulation. The brain literally rewires itself to expect failure, dampening the neural circuits of initiative and resilience. When the belief in helplessness takes root, it is not just an idea, it is a pattern encoded into the nervous system, influencing mood, energy, and behavior at the deepest level. The story of learned helplessness, however, is not entirely bleak. Later research revealed that not all animals or humans succumb equally. Some resist, continuing to fight despite repeated failures. This resilience led Seligman to refine his theory into what he later called learned optimism. The difference lies not just in the events themselves, but in how they are interpreted. People who explain failures as temporary, specific, and external are less likely to develop helplessness. Those who see failures as permanent, global, and personal fall into despair. In other words, the stories we tell ourselves about setbacks shape whether we learn helplessness or learn resilience. This insight has practical power. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, one of the most effective treatments for depression, often targets these explanatory styles. By helping individuals reframe failures, challenge negative beliefs, and recognize areas of control, therapists can break the cycle of helplessness. For example, teaching a student that "I failed this test because I used the wrong strategy" is healthier than "I failed because I'm stupid." The first leaves room for change, the second locks the door. Learned helplessness also sheds light on why people stay in jobs they hate, tolerate toxic relationships, or accept unfair conditions. Once someone believes they have no control, they stop seeking alternatives. The cage is open, but the dog stays inside. The challenge for change, then, is not only to provide opportunities, but also to rebuild belief in agency. Without that belief, even freedom tastes like captivity. The phenomenon is not limited to individuals. It shapes cultures, organizations, and nations. Companies with rigid hierarchies can breed helpless employees who stop offering ideas or solutions, convinced that nothing will change. Citizens in oppressive regimes may appear passive not because they lack desire for freedom, but because years of suppression have taught them that resistance is futile. In both cases, the weight of helplessness suffocates innovation, creativity, and hope. The paradox becomes even more fascinating when we recognize that helplessness can be unlearned. Just as it is conditioned into us, it can be conditioned out. Small experiences of control, successfully completing a task, making a choice, influencing an outcome, can rebuild the sense of agency. This is why empowerment programs focus on incremental victories. Each small success becomes proof that effort matters, gradually undoing the illusion of helplessness. At its core, learned helplessness forces us to ask an unsettling question. How much of our failure in life is truly about ability, and how much is about belief? If effort is abandoned not because success is impossible, but because we have convinced ourselves it is, then our greatest enemy may not be circumstance, but perception. This realization also shifts how we treat others. When someone gives up, it's easy to judge them as lazy or weak. But what if their passivity is not a choice, but a learned response to repeated futility? What if behind their silence lies years of doors slammed shut, efforts ignored, and struggles dismissed? Compassion grows when we see helplessness not as weakness, but as a wound. The ethical implications are profound. Environments that foster helplessness, whether through abuse, inequality, or systemic oppression, don't just hurt people in the moment. They rewire futures, robbing individuals of initiative long after the immediate harm is gone. To heal, society must not only remove barriers, but actively rebuild agency, offering people the proof that effort can indeed make a difference. There's a deeply personal dimension too. Most of us have tasted helplessness in some form. Perhaps it was a time when nothing we did seemed to improve a relationship, or when no amount of studying raised our grades, or when job applications led only to rejection. In those moments, it is easy to believe the illusion that nothing will ever change. But understanding the phenomenon gives us a weapon against it. We can remind ourselves, helplessness is not the truth. It is a lesson, one that can be unlearned. The paradox of learned helplessness is that it reveals both our fragility and our resilience. We are vulnerable to despair when trapped in cycles of failure, yet capable of extraordinary growth when even a spark of control is restored. Our minds can trick us into cages, but they can also unlock those cages once we learn to see them. So pause and reflect. Where in your life have you accepted helplessness? Where have you told yourself that effort doesn't matter? And what if that belief is the very thing holding you back? The door may already be open. The first step is daring to believe it. Learned helplessness is more than a psychological curiosity. It is a mirror, showing us the dangers of surrender and the power of belief. It reminds us that freedom begins not with the absence of barriers, but with the conviction that our actions matter. To escape the cage, we must first unlearn the lesson of helplessness, and then teach ourselves, step by step, that hope and agency can return. 25. Hedonic adaptation. Imagine winning the lottery. Overnight, your life transforms. You buy the house of your dreams, travel the world, and enjoy luxuries you once only fantasized about. For weeks, maybe even months, your happiness soars. Yet slowly, something unexpected happens. The thrill fades. The new house becomes ordinary, the luxury car feels normal, and the vacations lose their sparkle. You find yourself searching for the next big thing, craving the next high. On the other end of the spectrum, imagine suffering a devastating accident that leaves you disabled. At first, the pain is overwhelming, the grief unbearable. Yet months later, you find yourself laughing again, adjusting, even experiencing moments of contentment. What these two extremes reveal is a fundamental truth about the human mind. We adapt. This phenomenon is called hedonic adaptation, the tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of major positive or negative changes in life. The term hedonic comes from the Greek word hedon, meaning pleasure. Psychologists studying well-being noticed a paradox. Events that we assume will permanently change our happiness often have only temporary effects. Lottery winners, once euphoric, tend to return to their previous levels of happiness within a year. Similarly, people who suffer severe injuries often recover emotionally far more than expected. The initial spike or drop in happiness eventually levels out, pulling us back toward what researchers call our set point. The idea gained prominence in the 1970s when Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell described the hedonic treadmill. They argued that people are like runners on a treadmill. No matter how fast they run, they stay in the same place. In terms of happiness, this means that no matter what we achieve, we adapt to it and soon find ourselves desiring more. Wealth, status, relationships, and possessions may boost happiness temporarily, but the effect diminishes as novelty fades. This adaptation is deeply rooted in evolution. For our ancestors, survival required constant striving. Becoming complacent after one success could be dangerous. Adapting quickly to good fortune ensured continued effort, while adapting to hardship ensured resilience. From an evolutionary standpoint, hedonic adaptation kept humans motivated, always reaching for more, always adjusting to less. But in the modern world, where survival is less precarious, this adaptation often leaves us chasing happiness like a mirage, never satisfied for long. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You finally land the promotion you've been dreaming of. For weeks, your happiness surges. You feel accomplished, respected, financially secure. But soon the extra income becomes normal. The title loses its glow, and the job brings new stresses. You adapt. Or imagine buying the latest smartphone. At first, it feels sleek, exciting, revolutionary. But within months, it's just your phone, subject to scratches, updates, and eventual obsolescence. The thrill fades, and you find yourself longing for the next model. This cycle repeats endlessly, fueling consumer culture and personal dissatisfaction. Hedonic adaptation also explains why humans are remarkably resilient in the face of tragedy. People often say, "I could never survive that," when imagining loss or hardship. Yet research shows that many who experience severe illness, loss, or trauma eventually return to near baseline levels of happiness. This does not mean the pain vanishes, but that the mind finds ways to adapt, building new routines, relationships, and meanings that restore balance. What once seemed unbearable becomes part of a new normal. The paradox of hedonic adaptation is that it is both a blessing and a curse. It protects us from being crushed by misfortune, but it also robs us of lasting joy from success. We adapt to both suffering and delight, creating a life that hovers around a steady emotional set point. Happiness becomes less about external events and more about internal interpretation. Neuroscience sheds light on why this happens. Our brains are wired to notice change more than stability. Novelty sparks dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation and reward. But as stimuli become familiar, dopamine responses diminish. The brain stops reacting with excitement to what it already knows. This is why the new car excites us less after a few months, and why even profound losses eventually stop dominating our emotional lives. The brain is designed to normalize. The implications for modern living are profound. If happiness fades with every achievement, then chasing external goals, money, fame, possessions, may never deliver lasting satisfaction. This treadmill of desire explains why many wealthy individuals remain restless, seeking more despite already having more than enough. It also explains why ordinary pleasures, like a sunset, a meal with friends, or a walk in nature, can provide as much lasting contentment as major life events, because these small joys can be renewed repeatedly, each time offering fresh novelty. Hedonic adaptation also intersects with relationships. The euphoria of new love is intense, but often fades as partners adapt to each other. What once felt electrifying becomes routine, leading some to mistake adaptation for loss of love. Yet understanding this process allows couples to cultivate novelty, appreciation, and shared experiences that counteract the treadmill. Love does not disappear. It simply requires conscious renewal against the current of adaptation. There is also a societal dimension. Consumer culture thrives on hedonic adaptation. Advertisements promise lasting happiness through new purchases, but companies know the effect will fade, driving customers back for more. The treadmill keeps economies spinning, even as individuals remain unfulfilled. Recognizing this cycle is a step toward liberation, realizing that lasting happiness is not sold in stores, but cultivated in habits of gratitude, presence, and meaning. Philosophers and spiritual traditions have long intuited this truth. The Stoics warned that chasing external pleasures leads only to disappointment, because the mind quickly grows accustomed and craves more. Buddhism teaches that attachment and craving are the roots of suffering, echoing the modern understanding of hedonic adaptation. Both traditions point toward a solution. Shift focus inward, cultivating acceptance, mindfulness, and appreciation of the present moment. But can we escape the treadmill entirely? Research suggests that while we cannot stop adaptation, we can slow it down. Practices like gratitude journaling remind us to notice and savor what we already have, preventing it from fading into the background. Acts of kindness and altruism generate lasting satisfaction because they create meaning, not just pleasure. Experiences, especially shared ones, often provide more enduring happiness than material possessions because they continue to live in memory and story. Novelty and variety also matter. Exploring new places, learning new skills, and breaking routines help keep life fresh, slowing the slide back to baseline. The paradox of hedonic adaptation also raises ethical questions. If humans constantly adapt, how should we structure societies? Should we focus less on raising material wealth beyond a certain point and more on creating conditions for meaning, community, and purpose? Research shows that beyond a threshold of basic comfort, additional wealth contributes little to happiness. Yet entire economies remain fixated on endless growth, feeding the treadmill while neglecting deeper sources of well-being. There is also a personal challenge here. If we know that new achievements will not bring lasting happiness, how do we find motivation to pursue them? The answer lies in shifting our goals from pure pleasure to growth and contribution. Striving for mastery, purpose, or service to others provides satisfaction that adaptation cannot fully erode. A musician practicing for years, a parent raising a child, an activist fighting for justice, these pursuits generate meaning that outlasts novelty. At its core, hedonic adaptation forces us to confront the limits of external happiness. It whispers the unsettling truth that nothing outside of us can guarantee lasting joy. The house, the job, the partner, the victory, all will fade into normalcy. But rather than despair, this realization can be liberating. If happiness does not depend entirely on external gains, then we are freer to find it in simple, present, and enduring ways. The treadmill is real, but it does not trap us completely. We can step off at times, savoring the moment rather than racing toward the next prize. We can practice gratitude, cultivate mindfulness, seek novelty and learning, and ground ourselves in meaning. In doing so, we turn adaptation from a curse into a teacher, reminding us not to cling to highs or be crushed by lows, but to find balance in the steady rhythm of life. So pause and reflect. What are you chasing, and how long will its joy last? What have you already adapted to, forgetting its value? And what would happen if you stopped running, if you noticed the ground beneath your feet, if you realized that the happiness you seek is not always out ahead, but often right here, waiting to be noticed? Hedonic adaptation is more than a psychological curiosity. It is a mirror, showing us why joy fades and why resilience endures. It reveals the limits of pleasure and the promise of meaning, and it challenges us to stop running on the treadmill of desire, to step off, breathe, and rediscover the quiet, lasting satisfaction of being fully alive in this moment. 26. The false consensus effect. Imagine sitting at dinner with friends and voicing an opinion about politics, a movie, or even something as small as your favorite food. As you speak, you feel certain that most people around the table must agree with you. After all, it seems so obvious, so reasonable. But then someone raises an eyebrow, another disagrees, and you realize with surprise that your assumption was wrong. What felt like common sense was only your perspective. This illusion of assuming that our beliefs, values, and behaviors are more widely shared than they actually are is known as the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is one of the most persistent cognitive biases. It refers to our tendency to project our own attitudes and preferences onto others, believing that the majority must think as we do. Psychologists first documented this in the late 1970s. In one classic study, researchers asked participants whether they would be willing to walk around their campus wearing a large sandwich board with the words "Eat at Joe's." Some agreed, others refused. But regardless of their decision, Both groups believed that most of their peers would make the same choice they had. The consensus was not real. It was an illusion born from projection. At its heart, the false consensus effect reveals a fundamental flaw in human social cognition. We confuse the familiarity of our own thoughts with universality. Because our beliefs feel self-evident, we assume others must share them. This is comforting. It makes us feel less isolated, more validated, but it also blinds us to diversity of thought, creating misunderstandings, conflicts, and divisions. The roots of this bias are both cognitive and emotional. Cognitively, our own experiences are the most available to us, making them the easiest reference point. We cannot fully inhabit the minds of others, so we use ourselves as the default model. Emotionally, believing in consensus provides reassurance. It feels safer to assume that others share our views than to confront the possibility of being alone or in the minority. Consensus, even imagined, reduces anxiety. The false consensus effect shows up everywhere in daily life. Think of politics. A liberal assumes that most people see the world as they do, just as a conservative assumes the same. Both groups are shocked by election results that contradict their expectations because they mistake their social circles for the broader population. Social media amplifies this effect, creating echo chambers where people encounter mostly like-minded voices. Surrounded by agreement, they assume their beliefs are widely held, when in reality, the digital environment is carefully curated. The effect also distorts relationships. A person who values loyalty above all may assume their partner feels the same, leading to disappointment when the partner makes a decision based on independence instead. Friends may clash when one assumes everyone knows something, only to find that the other does not. These moments of friction reveal how much of our social life is based not on understanding, but on projection. One of the most striking consequences of the false consensus effect is how it shapes morality. People often believe that their own ethical standards are universal, that any decent person would make the same choice. Yet moral frameworks differ dramatically across cultures and individuals. What feels self-evidently right to one group may feel deeply wrong to another. Assuming consensus in matters of morality leads not only to misunderstanding, but to judgment and conflict. The phenomenon also has a darker side in fueling prejudice. People who hold discriminatory beliefs often assume that most others secretly agree with them. This false sense of majority emboldens prejudice, allowing harmful ideologies to persist. The illusion of consensus provides cover, turning private bias into public action. History is full of examples where individuals or groups, convinced their views were widely shared, pushed harmful agendas under the false banner of collective agreement. The paradox of the false consensus effect is that it simultaneously isolates and unites. On one hand, it makes us feel less alone by convincing us that others think like us. On the other hand, it deepens divisions because each group imagines itself as the majority, dismissing the other as fringe or deviant. In this way, the bias fuels polarization, leaving societies fractured into camps of imagined consensus. Neuroscience offers clues to why this happens. Brain imaging studies show that when people make judgments about others, they often activate the same regions they use to think about themselves. This simulation mechanism is efficient. It allows us to predict behavior by projecting our own perspective. But when overused, it creates blind spots. Instead of truly understanding others, we substitute ourselves for them. The brain mistakes self-reference for empathy. Yet the false consensus effect is not always harmful. In some cases, it fosters cooperation. Believing others share our values can encourage pro-social behavior, like volunteering or voting, because we feel part of a larger collective. The illusion of consensus can create solidarity, even if it is partly false. The danger lies in letting this illusion go unchallenged, turning reassurance into arrogance and projection into conflict. The bias also shapes business and leadership. Marketers who assume everyone loves their product based on their own tastes, risk alienating consumers with different preferences. Leaders who project their values onto employees may misunderstand motivations, creating policies that backfire. Innovation stalls when companies assume that customer needs mirror their own. The failure to recognize diversity of perspective is not just a social flaw, it can be an economic one. Breaking free from the false consensus effect requires deliberate effort. One strategy is perspective taking, consciously asking, how might someone with a different background see this? Another is data, relying on surveys, research, and evidence rather than assumptions. Exposing ourselves to diverse voices also helps, expanding our circles beyond echo chambers. The more variety we encounter, the harder it becomes to assume universality. But perhaps the most important antidote is humility. Recognizing that our beliefs are not self-evident truths, but perspectives shaped by culture, experience, and personality, softens our certainty. It opens space for dialogue, curiosity, and respect. Instead of assuming agreement, we learn to ask questions, to listen, to accept difference without defensiveness. There is also a personal liberation in dismantling this bias. The false consensus effect does not just make us overestimate agreement, it also makes us fear judgment. We assume that if we act differently, others will disapprove, because everyone follows the norm. In reality, people are far less united in their judgments than we imagine. By letting go of assumed consensus, we free ourselves from imaginary pressure, discovering more room for authenticity. Consider this. Every person is living in a slightly different world, shaped by unique experiences, beliefs, and values. Consensus exists, but it is rarer than we think and often thinner. The false consensus effect blinds us to this diversity, but it also gives us the chance to rediscover it. When we recognize that not everyone thinks as we do, the world becomes richer, more complex, more surprising. The paradox is that difference, not consensus, is the norm. Humanity is a mosaic of perspectives, not a mirror of our own minds. The false consensus effect teaches us how easy it is to forget this and how important it is to remember. So pause and reflect. Where in your life have you assumed consensus that wasn't there? Where have you mistaken your circle for the world, your perspective for the truth? And what might change if you approached others not with the assumption of agreement, but with the curiosity of discovery? The false consensus effect is more than a psychological curiosity. It is a lesson in humility, diversity, and empathy. It reminds us that our minds are not universal, that our beliefs are not obvious, and that true connection begins not with projection, but with listening. In a world fractured by imagined consensus, perhaps the greatest wisdom is learning to see others not as reflections of ourselves, but as unique beings with truths of their own. 27. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Picture a man standing confidently at a podium, delivering a speech on a subject he barely understands. His voice is steady, his gestures bold, his smile unwavering. To him, he is an expert. To the audience, however, his ignorance is obvious. Now, imagine a quiet woman in the same room who has studied the subject for years. When asked to contribute, she hesitates, doubting whether she knows enough. This strange inversion, where the ignorant feel certain and the knowledgeable feel uncertain, is the essence of the Dunning-Kruger effect. First described in 1999 by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, this cognitive bias reveals that people with low ability in a task often overestimate their competence, while experts tend to underestimate theirs. The less someone knows, the less aware they are of their own ignorance. Conversely, the more someone learns, the more they recognize the vastness of what they don't know. It is ignorance that breeds confidence, and expertise that breeds humility. The origins of this effect lie in a series of experiments. Dunning and Kruger tested participants on humor, grammar, and logic. Afterward, they asked them to evaluate their own performance. Those who scored in the lowest quartile consistently overestimated their abilities, often ranking themselves above average. Meanwhile, those in the highest quartile tended to underestimate their performance, assuming others had done just as well. The results were clear. Incompetence doesn't just mean poor performance. It also means the inability to recognize poor performance. This paradox is captured in the phrase, "If you're incompetent, you can't know you're incompetent." Lack of skill deprives people of the very insight needed to see their mistakes. It's like being tone deaf and thinking you sing beautifully because you cannot hear the flaws. Or writing poorly and believing your prose is elegant because you lack the tools to recognize awkward phrasing. The less you know, the less you realize you don't know. The Dunning-Kruger effect is visible everywhere. In classrooms, students with the weakest grasp of material often express the most confidence before exams, while top students worry they're unprepared. In workplaces, employees with little experience may boldly volunteer for tasks they cannot handle, while skilled professionals hesitate, questioning their worth. Online, entire communities thrive on misplaced certainty, where people with minimal knowledge argue as though they were experts. The world is full of confident mistakes. The effect also shapes politics. Studies show that people with limited knowledge of policy often have the strongest opinions, unwilling to consider nuance. Meanwhile, experts who understand the complexity of issues tend to express uncertainty, acknowledging ambiguity. This creates a dangerous imbalance. The loudest voices are often the least informed, while the wisest voices are drowned out by their own humility. There is also a cultural dimension. In societies that reward confidence, people who project certainty, regardless of accuracy, often rise to positions of power. Charismatic leaders may captivate crowds while lacking deep understanding. Meanwhile, genuine experts may be overlooked because their caution and humility are misinterpreted as weakness. The Dunning-Kruger effect thus shapes not only individuals but entire hierarchies, allowing confidence to masquerade as competence. The paradox extends to personal relationships. Someone may believe they are an excellent communicator while consistently failing to listen. Another may think they are charming while irritating everyone around them. Without feedback or the ability to interpret it, they remain blind to their shortcomings. Meanwhile, people who are genuinely thoughtful, empathetic, or skilled often doubt themselves, sensing their imperfections more acutely. Neuroscience helps explain this bias. Research suggests that self-evaluation requires the same cognitive skills as the task itself. If you lack the skill, you also lack the tools to judge performance. For example, evaluating a logical argument requires logical reasoning. If you struggle with reasoning, you will likely fail both at solving the problem and at recognizing your errors. The weakness is doubled. Incompetence blocks performance and blinds self-awareness. Yet there is a hopeful side to this effect. Awareness of one's ignorance is the first step toward growth. Many experts describe a moment early in their learning when they realized how little they knew. This humility, though painful, sparked their pursuit of mastery. It is not confidence but curiosity, not certainty but doubt, that drives true learning. In this way, the Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that insecurity can be a sign of wisdom. Consider the journey of knowledge as a curve. At the beginning, with little exposure, confidence is high because the subject seems simple. As learning deepens, confidence plummets, overwhelmed by complexity. But with persistence, mastery grows and confidence slowly rises again, this time tempered by humility. This curve explains why beginners are bold, intermediates are doubtful, and experts are cautious but quietly competent. True mastery lies not in overconfidence, but in the balance of knowledge and humility. The implications for education are profound. Teachers often encounter students who overestimate their understanding, resistant to correction because they believe they are already right. Helping these students requires patience, guiding them to see their gaps without crushing their confidence. For advanced students, the challenge is the opposite, reminding them that doubt does not mean incompetence, but awareness. Encouraging humility while nurturing resilience helps both groups grow. In workplaces, the Dunning-Kruger effect warns against mistaking confidence for ability. Managers must learn to evaluate performance based on evidence, not self-assessment. Otherwise, they risk promoting the loudest voices rather than the most competent. This is especially crucial in fields where mistakes carry heavy consequences. Medicine, engineering, law, where misplaced confidence can endanger lives. The effect also teaches us something about communication. When arguing with someone who is deeply ignorant but supremely confident, logic alone may not persuade them. Their lack of knowledge blinds them to counter-arguments. Patience, education, and humility are more effective than confrontation. Likewise, when we ourselves feel overly certain, it is wise to pause and ask, do I truly know, or am I under the spell of this bias? The Dunning-Kruger effect also invites us to reflect inward. How often have we mistaken our limited knowledge for expertise? How many times have we spoken with certainty, only to later discover how wrong we were? Recognizing this bias is humbling, but it can also make us more compassionate. Everyone, at some point, has stood in that man's shoes at the podium, confidently ignorant. Awareness helps us forgive others, even as it reminds us to guard against arrogance. There is a striking irony in the Dunning-Kruger effect. Those who most need to recognize it are the least likely to do so. The incompetent cannot see their incompetence, but those who suspect they might be subject to it, those who worry about being overconfident, are already one step closer to wisdom. The very act of questioning oneself suggests an awareness missing in true ignorance. History offers countless examples of this bias shaping human events. Leaders who believed themselves invincible launched wars they could not win. Inventors convinced of their genius released flawed creations that harmed more than helped. Economies collapsed under the weight of policies built on misplaced certainty. At the same time, breakthroughs often came from those who admitted doubt, who recognized the limits of their knowledge and sought help, collaboration, and continued learning. Ultimately, the Dunning-Kruger effect forces us to rethink the nature of confidence. Confidence alone is not evidence of truth. Certainty is not proof of knowledge. The most dangerous voices are often the loudest, and the wisest are often the quietest. To navigate this paradox, we must learn to value humility as much as confidence, and to judge ability not by self-assurance, but by evidence and results. So, pause and reflect. Where in your life might you be overestimating your competence? Where might your certainty mask ignorance? And where might your doubt actually be a sign of wisdom? The Dunning-Kruger effect is not just a psychological curiosity. It is a mirror, showing us the dangers of arrogance and the power of humility. It reminds us that true knowledge is not loud, but careful, not certain, but curious, not blind, but aware. In a world filled with confident voices, perhaps the greatest wisdom is to admit, I might be wrong.